Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Mr. David Kerry, formerly of Rbkc. So I'm going to ask Mr. Kerry to come back in, please.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Kerry. I'm sorry. Do sit down and make yourself comfortable.
Thank you.
And ready to carry on, I hope.
Thank you, yes.
Good. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Good morning, members of the panel. Mr. Kerry, good morning to you. May I take a step halfway back to something that we discussed together, you and I, yesterday, about the minimum standards for London in 2016, under the topic of the voluntary sector. And I asked you why there was no documented strategy in place for community resilience, detailing a programme of ultimate agency collaborative work with emergency responders. And I was asking you that for our purposes, reference-wise, at 264, page 156, line 19. Now, your answer, and I'll quote it to you, but if you need to see it in the transcript, we can look at it, was at page 157, day 264, 157, 13 to 18. And what you said was, I think that was something yet to be got to. So the best answer I can give you, I think that was something yet to be got to at that time. Do you recall giving that evidence?
I think so, yes.
Yes. And what you did then was to go on to describe unsuccessful efforts to engage buy-in with certain community partners, and you named the Diocese, Church of England, and Keith Robbins going to the Catholic equivalent, and that the outcome was only promises to assist if need be.
Yes.
Have I summarised your evidence
Indeed,
accurately,
yes.
do you think? Yes. Now, first question, as a result of all of that, is did you approach other faith groups, for example, the Almanar Cultural Centre?
Keith certainly visited and approached that centre in terms of getting them successfully on board as a potential emergency rest centre and a good relationship there. In terms of the community engagement plan type of engagement, I don't think we met them specifically on that. What we had been to, both Keith and I, was to a meeting of the Borough Multi-Faiths Forum, at which all of those faiths were represented, where we presented and talked about community resilience and engagement and what have you. My recollection of that meeting is that we came out of there with no real sense of wanting to follow on in any concrete terms. But I believe that Keith then did actually go and speak to some of those individual organisations, and I think that was my reference to people saying, you know, well, we're small, we can't engage. I can't recall whether that included that discussion with the centre. Probably not, but certainly the successful relationship with the centre was in terms of their willingness to be an emergency rest centre.
When was the meeting that you've just referred to?
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't recall that. It was held in the Mayor's Parlour. There were about 50-odd people there. It wasn't the year before the fire. I'm sorry, it was some time before.
Very well.
It was some time before.
Did you engage with the various non-faith community organisations, such as the Rugby Portobello Trust or the Clement James Centre?
I think dynamically only in respect as being potentially for rest centres and their role in supporting us as a rest centre.
Right.
So the engagements there was very much our request, and they're saying yes, they would be happy, and giving their contact details for call out for rest centre purposes. But I don't think it was in terms of any defined community resilience plan.
Did you ever have a plan, a fixed plan, as to how systematically you would engage with a range of community groups, both secular and faith, and resident groups for that matter?
No, we didn't have a fixed plan for that.
Do you accept that there was a failure to involve local groups who might be more likely to understand the local community?
Well, in the sheer black and white of the statement, I would say we didn't have that strategy, but I think life is not quite as clear-cut as that, right. And I think I have described, you know, the fact that we were aware of the value. We did make some attempts over quite some time. I'm quite sure our experience was no difference to an awful lot of local authorities around the UK, and I can say that because I've chatted to some other local authorities at various events about the difficulty of community resilience. So the strict answer is no, we didn't have that engagement plan, but I would invite you to consider that it's not quite as simple as that statement.
Right. Can I just show you something and see if you agree with it? CFV 6050, please. And what I'm showing you here is a statement from Andrew Langford, who's from Cruise Bereavement Care. If you go, please, to page 5 in this document, this is his inquiry statement. Page 5, look, please, at paragraph 24. Under the heading 13B, your observations on the official response between 14th June and 20th June 2017. He says, the early coordination meetings on the 15th, 16th and 17th of June 2017 seemed to demonstrate that there was an unsureness on the part of the local authority as to what the official voluntary sector partners and the wider community could offer in terms of support. This was clearer later in the proceedings, as the mutual aid and coordination from central government commenced, which was extremely beneficial. However, a clear understanding of what the voluntary sector could offer at an earlier stage by the local authority would have, in Cruise's view, hastened further support to people affected by the incident. And then he goes on to say, a little bit later in his statement, that there needed to be more of an understanding about how the voluntary sector could be utilised in order to assist the relief effort. But just on what I've shown you, would you agree with what he says there?
I would agree with that statement as has been made, but Cruise was one of the organisations locally that Keith Robbins had visited as part of that attempt to engage pre-emergency, and my recollection is that was one of the organisations that said we'd be delighted to assist if we can, but we're a small organisation, we're not really here during the daytime, and he came away without any sort of dynamic working relationship on that. We had the contact numbers for it.
Yes.
The statement, as written there, yes, that statement is correct. But again, I think there is context here.
And if you go to page 8 in this same statement, please, and look, please, at paragraph 35, he says there, as I said to you, it was very much left to Cruise to initiate how we could be involved, and this had to be driven by Cruise to a great extent. There needed to be more of an understanding about how the voluntary sector could be utilised in order to assist the relief effort. This would include voluntary sector organisations officially involved, as well as those smaller groups in the local community that were assisting people anyway as part of their work in that community. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would get back to the context I gave earlier, but yes, as a statement, that's a correct statement.
Yes. And then if you turn to page 9, he identifies, so far as he's concerned, the adequacy of the response and lessons learnt from it. And he says at 39 in particular, let's pick it up at 38. There needs to be further clarity as to what the voluntary sector can offer in the wake of a major incident. This is specifically in relation to what formal voluntary sector partners can offer when they can best add value. A dry run or two of different major incidents may well assist in understanding this. And then he says at paragraph 39, further understanding about how local authorities can engage local community groups and resources will be useful. There was much capacity to support people affected through local community groups. However, there seemed to be no links between the local authority and those community groups in the North Kensington area, just post-incident. It would have been beneficial for there to be a protocol or mutual agreement in place between community organisations to support, should there be such an event. Now, clearly this is his opinion, based on the experiences he had, but would you share his opinion in those two paragraphs that he's expressed?
Yes, I would share that opinion, and I think that would be, if an outcome, one of the many outcomes from this inquiry could be that local authorities concentrate on this engagement, and if local organisations are aware of that, that would be a terrific outcome.
And would you agree with what Rbkc have said in their opening, that a greater level of pre-fire liaison would have meant that the council was better placed to coordinate and direct local community organisations when they were most needed?
Yes, indeed, that would have been the case.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to come back to the question of rest centres very shortly. But before I do, can we then turn to the events of the night and the opening of the Beck after your 3:31 call with Mr. Priestley? And you spoke to him again, I think. If we go to RBK 3013296. And if we go, please, to entry 25, which we will find on page 5, at the very bottom of the page. At 4:52 a.m., you called Stuart Priestley, and there was an update. He was on his way to the Kensington Town Hall. Now, first of all, can you confirm that?
Yes.
Yes. Now, he's exhibited an email he sent to you, which tells you that he was in a cab. We don't need to look at it, but he provides specific times in his statement for when he left home and then arrived at the town hall. He says he arrived at the town hall at 04:38, according to his statement. Do you think that that might be right and that your log might be wrong?
I can only say that I'm assuming, because I've got a precise time, I can only assume that's what I wrote in my notebook. I can't say whether that was correct or incorrect now after this amount of time, but that will have been the notes that I had. If his time says something else, I'm entirely happy to accept that he thinks that was the time. I can't say other than that, I'm afraid.
Can I just ask you in that connection, what was the source material from which you compiled the emergency event log sheet?
It was my notebooks that you have and my memory as such as it was.
Right, I see. No other documents?
No.
Right. In your first statement, and again, we don't need to go to it, at page 17, paragraph 77, you say that at 05:35, you left for the town hall in Kensington and arrived there at 05:50. Is that right?
Yes.
And you also say that at that point, a number of people were there already. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you remember who they were?
From memory, Stuart Priestley, Elaine Chumnery, Anne Stewart. I'm trying to think, was Laura Johnson there? Can I see my log, please, for that? Because I think I may have noted down.
Well, which log?
The log we're looking at, the next page, perhaps. You
can, but I'm not sure which page. I'm not sure. Well, yeah. Let's try page 7 and see if that helps. 05:35. I left home and got a taxi to Kensington Town Hall. And then in the action response column, you say I arrived.
And so I can see I listed the 4 people I've just mentioned.
Was the Beck up and running at that point?
As a fully functioning Beck, with everything fired up and thing, no, not at that point. At this point, some computers were on, some people were answering phones, information was starting to be gathered, and people were having a discussion about the event and where they were going. It wasn't a fully staffed Beck. It wasn't fully fired up in that respect. So it was in the process of transitioning into the Beck. I see.
Can we just clarify this through Stuart Priestley's statement, because he was there, as we see from this document. Can we go, please, to RBK 3035672? That's the first page, and if we can go, please, to page 5 in it, paragraph 22. He says, when I arrived at the town hall, I was initially delayed by the town hall's security systems in accessing the first floor where my laptop was located, and then the Holland room in the basement. The night watch officer assisted with access. The Holland room is a regular meeting room which can be configured into a Beck. There is a portion of the desk which rises to make Beck phones and computers available. To enable this and to access other items such as paper versions of the emergency plans, one needed access to a locked cupboard. The key was locked at reception, but I found it to be lost after some time trying to locate it. This led to delay in setting up the room and configuring the dedicated Beck computers. At 05:25 a.m. I emailed David Kerry to say that we could not open the cupboard and asking him to come to the town hall. Now, clearly you were not with him at that time, but so far as you can tell us, do you agree or disagree with what he says there?
He told me that experience about the locked cupboard later on when I got there, so I can agree with what he's saying.
In fact, he did more, I think. Can we go to RBK 3035661? this is an email from him to you at 05:25 with no text in it other than the subject line, can you come PDQ? We cannot get into the cupboards. Now, presumably you were on your way, were you, at that stage? Or had not quite left? I think you hadn't left, in fact, had you?
If I hadn't quite left, I was presumably at that point of getting everything together to leave.
Right. Okay. And it's right, is it, that he couldn't find the key, but you had it?
So I had a key, and so did my staff. A key for use by other people in the Beck for security purposes. I had arranged with our 24-hour staffed reception desk, known as Civic Reception, quite some time previously when we'd acquired this equipment. The key in an envelope with instructions on to be kept securely by them, to be signed out to people on receipt of their security badge should there be need to open the Beck. That was not untypical for key holding for various parts. Other departments had arrangements with security for that. So the idea was, rather than having loads of people with keys and not those people being there on the night when you needed them, the key was at security, securely held, and could be signed out. Apparently, it could not be found. The key wasn't there, so that delayed. As a result of that, afterwards, we got a key box which we glued to the outside of the cupboard with a keypad number on system, so that all of the resilience people would know the keypad number, and that therefore there would not be this risk of another part losing a key again. So with the best efforts, we had put in what we thought was a secure system of making a key available whenever it was needed to the right people. There was a failure in that system because at some point that key had disappeared and the security officer couldn't find it.
But you had a spare?
I had a key and my staff had keys.
Right.
For daily use, because we would be in and out at times, putting stuff, updating things and what have you.
Did Stuart Priestley not have a key, given that he was your line manager?
No, not at that time, because we thought, the secure and appropriate method, should he have needed it or anybody else who needed it out of ours.
Did you ever get to the bottom of why this supposedly robust system for making sure that the key was there when needed failed on the night?
No, the answer was just simply nobody could find it, nobody knew why it wasn't there.
But I mean, most people would regard that as hopeless.
I can only tell you we put in what we thought was the appropriate security system with the security staff, and I can only tell you that, very unfortunately, that key was not there at the time it was needed.
Was it possible for you to set up the Beck remotely from home?
At that point, no.
Were you aware?
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Do you mean the physical Beck in the town hall? Could I set that up remotely from home?
Yes.
No, I couldn't do that.
Couldn't.
So one needed to be there physically to do that.
Right. And what was it in the cupboards that was so critical, for which the key was required?
So if I may describe the Beck, there was a large, what you would look at and see, a large boardroom-style table. In the centre of that was a portion that would rise up. Within that bit rising up were the screens, the keyboards and the mice of the computers that were the Beck computers. In the cupboard were the devices to raise electronically the part of that thing to bring the computers up. So they couldn't get to the computers without getting into the cupboard.
Right. So it's simply physical access to mechanical hardware.
Yeah.
Were you aware, as the Beck was being set up, that there were IT issues with some of the Beck systems that prevented people logging on?
No.
You weren't aware of that? Are you aware of something called the VIMS, or VIMS, or I think as it's called, Vanessa's Information Management System?
By that time, it was the ILS, I think, the information logging system. That was I've described earlier our logging system on Microsoft SharePoint, and that was the name of it, the information logging system. Right. Previously, VIMS, Vanessa's Information Management System, it was a nod to the extraordinary work that one of our temporary colleagues some years previously had done in devising the system for me. She interpreted what I wanted and did it. We called it an information management system. We later changed that because actually it wasn't managing information, it was logging information. And of course, after Vanessa had gone, it was rather silly to keep that name. It was a sort of a nod to Vanessa's extraordinary work, but that was rather time expired. So these days it's the ILS information logging system, which I think is much more descriptive of what it is. But it was that Microsoft SharePoint system that I described yesterday.
Right. Now, let me just show you what Rebecca Blackburn says in her statement. RBK 30 is 58170, page 14, paragraph 9.9. That's RBK 30 is 58170. There it is, paragraph 9.9. She says, firstly, there was a delay in access to the Beck computers, which caused a backlog. This meant that it was not until 1300 hours that a Beck officer, Lorna Platt, became available to open the Beck log. Did you know about that?
No, because I had opened a Beck log before I left that morning. So before I left that morning, the computer systems were up and they were working. I went into the ILS system and created a Beck log, so it was open. I didn't do anything within that, but I had opened that for the team to use. And at that point, I think I was left and called away to other meetings and then left. At 1300, it appears that Lorna Platt then went in and created another log. So if you look at the system, you'll see my earlier reference with nothing in it. You will then see around about 1300, 1303, I think it was, that Lorna created that second log, and that got populated from there on in.
Right. Can you explain, well, do you know whether, from your own recollection, what Rebecca Blackburn is saying here in the first part of paragraph 9.9 is correct?
It is correct that Lorna Platt opened a Beck log at around 1300. I don't recognise the delay of access to the computers other than the bit of raising the table. By the time I got there, that table was up and there were computers open, and I sat at one of them at one point and created a log for their use.
Did you tell those in the room that you had opened an ILS, a log, the Beck log?
You know, I don't know. I may have said, I just don't know. I created a log for it to be used.
Right.
I was then hurried away to a meeting.
Right.
But it was there on the system and the computer was open and it was there.
Can you explain how it could come about then that Rebecca Blackburn would think that there was no Beck log until Lorna Platt had to open a further one at 1 o'clock?
I don't know.
Right. Look at paragraph 9.10.
Sorry, before we go on, can I just ask for your help on this? When you left, having got the system up physically and electronically, and having created a log, who was in charge of the room?
So Stuart Priestley was there, having taken over as Council Silver. Elaine Chumry was there as one of our trained Beck staff. So they were the two people that, Elaine particularly familiar with the Taven systems, and Stuart in charge. And there were also the other people there at the time, but it was Stuart as Council Silver and Elaine as the Beck officer.
And the primary means of obtaining and transferring information and logging information would be the computers, I assume, would they? Or the telephone?
So at that point, telephone, emails coming in, people writing things on notebooks or what have you. The idea would be, ideally, you would try and then, when you've done something, you would make an entry in the log about that, if that was something that was pertinent.
Yes, and the emails would come in, on the Beck computers?
Yes, the Beck had its own email address.
I'm just trying to understand, you see, how it could be that those who were in charge following your departure didn't populate your information log, and apparently, if Ms. Blackwood's right, didn't realise you'd opened one.
I don't know. I do not know why there was no log created until that time. I opened it. I did leave the room at that point because I was then going on to the meeting, which I'm sure we'll discuss with Mr. Holgate and others, and then I left the town hall without going back to the Beck. All I can say is, at that particular point, there was a Beck there, there were the first staff there. We had got the computers up and opened, and I did create a log. I'm sorry, Mr. Millett, I cannot remember, did I say I've opened this or not? I just can't remember. All I can tell you is what I've said, and at that point I think I probably left the room.
one last question then. Should it normally be apparent from the computer that a log has been opened?
I think that on each of the individual computers, the person would have had to have then opened that system and then would see the log. So it didn't pop up automatically on all of the computers. Each computer would have had to have been fired up, and then you would have clicked on and opened that log, and you would have found the entry and you would have gone into it and opened it. So it did require that manual getting there by people. It didn't automatically pop up on the screen just because on one computer it had been opened.
All right, thank you. All right. Yes, Mr.
Yes. Looking at paragraph 9.10, Rebecca Blackburn says that it wasn't possible to access the VIMS ILS to start the log due to an IT technical issue that prevented logging in to VIMS ILS. When the BEC computers were accessible, VIMS ILS was not accessible. The problem with access had to be resolved by IT support. Did you know anything of that?
No, because at the time I was in there, I did successfully open the ILS, I did successfully get into it, and I did successfully create a log.
Right. Was it possible for you to set the log up from home?
It would have been possible through the laptop I had and its SIM card. I would have been able, and I think through Office 365, I think I would have been able to do so.
And why didn't you?
No time at that point. That's why I was recording everything in a dedicated notebook for it. Quite simply, calls in, calls out. I did not have the time to switch on a laptop, fire it up, go into the systems, start creating matters and what have you. It takes a little bit of time.
Yes, and we've seen that you've had made some handwritten notes starting at about 2:20. Mm-hmm. Did you hand those over to Stuart Priestley in the BEC when you left to go to your meetings?
No, I carried on using the notebook through, and I think I used 2 notebooks over the first 4 days, and which you have. So I, through my phone contacts with him and then speaking to him when I arrived, hand over, if you like, of information or knowledge at that point, but I did not give him my notebooks.
Yes. Do you agree that in setting up the BEC and in its first hours of operation on the morning of the 14th of June 2017, some at least of the shortcomings from previous training, like the 2015 exercise, responder exercise, were repeated?
I can only speak in terms of what was in there up to the point that I was in there. In the mayhem of that morning, what I can't do is speculate about what happened after I left that room.
Certainly. But so far as you were concerned, is this before you left, there were no IT problems in the BEC?
I was not aware of any IT problems in the BEC at that time. I was aware that there was BEC staff in and that we were starting to use the systems. I was not aware of any problems.
Right. Let's go to Rbkc 58194. This is your email 2 days later. Sorry, 2 months before. Your email to Tony Redpath. If we go to the foot of page 1, 16th of May 2017, 1 month before, forgive me, from you to Tony Redpath, Tony, and then over the page to page 2, it says, as with our PPU leadership group meeting discussion, I believe that the age and increasingly limited capability of the computers in the Borough Emergency Control Centre, Holland Room, Freeman Suite, presents a corporate risk. And then you explain in the next paragraph, the detail of that. And you can see that. For example, in the third line, new operating systems and software used by the council now run very slowly on these machines. Recent training and exercises in the BEC have shown that this impacts on the efficiency of the BEC, and the machines are not able to deal with GIS, something we would want to use in a BEC. The recent migration of email accounts to Office 365 was very problematical, requiring Keith, Rebecca and ISD colleagues spending a number of hours to make them work, and for a couple of weeks we were without a fully functioning BEC. It is necessary for a BEC to have computers permanently installed there, whether PC or laptop is immaterial, so that they're ready for use, have a BEC identity, it should be, and not an individual officer's identity, as would be the case were BEC staff to arrive with their own laptop and to map to the BEC servers and files, etc. And then there's some data in the box there, and then recommendation in bold capitals: the existing BEC computers be replaced with machines that will fully fit in with Council's current IT provision. And you can see, I think, from page 1 of this email chain, if we go back to that, that Tony Redpath responds to you on the 19th of May, copying in Stuart Priestley and Nicholas Holgate, saying, "David, thanks. I mentioned this issue to Nicholas earlier in the week, and he agreed that the computers ought to be replaced. It is probably simplest to carry the cost of doing so on a suitable code in your budget. I'm sure Nicholas will find a way to make good any end-of-year deficit in the unit's overall budget if that proves necessary." I'm copying to Kevin, so he's aware, and to Bridie, who I think was Bridie Green. So it looks as if that was agreed to.
Yes.
How long would it have taken to upgrade the IT system that you'd recommended?
So, having got the approval, that then went to the IT team, the upgrades team. The order was placed. I think from memory that it used to take about 4 weeks or so from ordering new IT kit for it to come and arrive. Certainly at some point after the fire, the equipment did arrive and the new laptops were all installed. So this was an order in progress at that time.
Why had the IT system in the BEC been allowed to become so old and slow and outdated?
Okay, old computers or slow, we will have all at times in the past, when we've got a new laptop or a new computer, realised it's a little bit quicker than the old. But, you know, from taking 60 seconds to fire up to taking 33 seconds to fire up, in the scheme of things, we all appreciate we've got a faster computer, but it isn't actually earth-shattering. So these computers were doing their job up to that point. We had got to the point where we were exploring as a team, wouldn't it be great to get GIS, the mapping system, actually in the BEC rather than just having to rely on somebody remotely to do that. At that point, we needed to get newer computers. And in the scheme of things, it's a good thing anyway. The authority was no longer issuing fixed permanent computers in. Staff were all given individual computers, laptops to carry around. I didn't want staff coming in with their laptop into a control centre, hence my remarks, the control centre needed to have its identity. The computers need to stay beyond different people coming in. We couldn't have people walking off with their computer at the end of their shift. So we had this provision of good computers as they were at the time they were put in. Like anything, there comes a point you need to do the changes. We actioned that, identified that, put the report in, we got the funding for it, and then the computers were ordered. Later on, those computers were installed. Before I left the authority, we'd done another revision of the computers in the scheme of things. Slow doesn't mean it took forever to do something. It's our experience. You get a new computer, it's faster than the old one. That doesn't mean to say the old one is that much of a problem. Well, we couldn't do the GIS, but we had the telephone numbers of the people to call from GIS who could actually do that GIS work for us.
But isn't it the case that you were flagging this issue to your senior, Tony Redpath, not because it would be nice to have a quicker computer, but because it was affecting the functionality and efficacy of the BEC if needed in an emergency? Because
of the new systems that were now coming in. So this wasn't something that was an issue 6 months previously, you know, but so we've identified the issue and acted upon it.
And was the existing state of the existing computer stock, the IT stock, a factor which contributed to the delay in setting up the BEC on the night?
I don't believe so. In my experience while I was there, we were opening the stuff up and I got straight into the ILS system and I created that log. So my experience in the short period I was in the BEC was not being aware of any IT problems. I can't comment on these problems because I wasn't there. I was only in the BEC a short time that morning. Did Rebecca Blackburn not report to you that there had been IT problems in the first hours of setting up the BEC after you'd left? I'm not aware of those problems, so the answer has to be, I believe not. Right. Let's then turn to a different topic, rest centres and the early stages in relation to their establishment for those displaced by the fire. We touched on
to the CMP yesterday and the provision of survivor reception centres. I think you agree that one of the authorities, local authorities' roles and responsibilities in the immediate aftermath was the establishment of something called survivor reception centres and friends and relative reception centres.
I've agreed those were Metropolitan Police responsibilities to which the authority might assist.
Yes, and so you said at page 33, lines 13 to 34, line 1 of yesterday's evidence, day 268. Now, I just want to see if we can clarify a number of things there. First of all, let's have your answer up on the screen. It's day 268, page 33, line 13. And I put to you at line 13, was it right that one of the local authorities' roles and responsibilities in the immediate response was the establishment of survivor reception centres and friends and relatives reception centres? And your answer was no. The responsibility for establishing those was the responsibility of the Metropolitan Police Service. The role of the authority would have been that if the Met Police said, have you got anywhere where we could house one of these centres, if we were able to provide either our own premises or from our rest centre premises knowledge of somewhere which could be used, we would do that. But the responsibility for all of those centres in that particular paragraph were the lead responsibility was the Metropolitan Police Service. Now, I would like, please, your help with the terms survivor reception centre and rest centre. Can we start, please, with the HA, the Humanitarian Assistance Framework document at GAOL 401256, please? And this is the Humanitarian Assistance Framework document published by the LRP, or under the umbrella of the LRP. And if we go, please, to page 24 in that document, we can see at 8.3 what a survivor reception centre is. At 8.4 and 8.5, under overview, under the heading Survivor Reception Centre, it says it may be set up following a major incident. It can be either a predetermined venue or whatever is suitable and available depending on the location of the major incident. Its function is to provide survivors who do not require hospital treatment a place to be directed to where they can be met by police and other services to obtain initial information and support in the immediate aftermath of the incident and give witness statements and evidence to police investigating officers. In the early stages of an incident where those involved are leaving the scene, it may not be practicable to establish an SRC because of other more pressing primary responsibilities, e.g. life-saving or clearing the public from danger. And then there's the purpose of the reception centre then set out underneath that at 8.6. And if you go over the page, please, to 8.8, it says this: the SRC will be set up immediately at a location as near as practicably possible to the incident site as determined by police tactical commander at the time of emergency. The police are responsible for opening an SRC, supported by the local authority, in accordance with the arrangements in the London Emergency Services Liaison Panel, LESLP manual. An SRC is likely to be run initially by the police, who will be first on the scene, until the local authority becomes engaged in the response to provide additional support. The police should deploy a documentation team to the SRC, who will pass on details gathered from survivors to the Central Casualty Bureau. A police security team should also be deployed to the SRC. And then at 8.10, the police should consult the local authority on a suitable location for the centre, if time allows, as the local authority may have access to a suitable building. Where it is not possible for the local authority to provide a suitable location, either within the proximity or time frame, the police will have to consider other options. Now, what contact did you have on the 14th of June 2017, if any, with the police, the MPS, in relation to the opening or classification of those centres, survivor centres?
I'm not aware of any approach by the police that I received, either from them or through my liaison officer. So I don't recall anything for that. I think later on, and I'm sure you'll come to that later on in my event log, I was telephoning in to various strategic or tactical coordination group meetings, and there was talk then about rest centres that were opening. I don't recall any specific request coming to me about a survivor reception centre.
Right. But it's not the case, is it, that the responsibility for a rest centre or this kind of centre is only engaged once there's a request made by the police?
As per this document and as within the London Emergency Services Liaison Panel's Major Incident Procedures Manual, all specifically states that the Survivor Reception Centre, if put in place at all, would be something that the Metropolitan Police would lead on and take responsibility for. Initially,
but then once engaged, then it would be the council's responsibility.
If such a place had been set up in the first place.
Right.
It wouldn't be, I don't have any awareness at all in my experience that there was an expectation that the local authority at some point would set up a survivor reception centre if the police hadn't. Because by that point we would have either an emergency rest centre in place, or we would be looking at a community support centre, or there would be other centres at that time. Survivor reception centre, my belief of that, from my experience, was always intended to be a quite short-term place. If the particular incident enables survivors to be sent to a particular place where they were able to go and the police could do their first engagement with them, that might happen. In an awful lot of incidences, survivor reception centres wouldn't happen, either because the circumstances of the event were such that people didn't disperse widely from the scene, or because of the public safety issues. So it was a tool there for the police if they had the capacity or the circumstances enable it to happen. It wasn't for the local authority to come and do if the police hadn't, but certainly had the police done one, that would be our responsibility to put some people into a system there.
Were you aware of whether there was an SRC set up on the 14th of June?
I'm not aware of one.
Then let's turn to a separate question, which is rest centres. They're covered in this same part of the HA framework under the heading Rest Centre 813, and it says explains what the purpose of a rest centre is. It's to provide immediate shelter for persons who've been evacuated from an area or are otherwise in need of emergency accommodation following an incident, initial light refreshments for evacuees, to enable details of evacuees to be maintained in the centre for reference, to provide for the well-being of the evacuees, and to offer support services and information on a wide range of welfare-related subjects, and to provide evacuees and survivors with updated information about the incident and its possible effects upon them directly. And then if you go to 815, the responsibility for the setup and running of rest centres lies with the local authority, supported by voluntary agencies, who would activate arrangements as outlined in their rest centre plan. The decision to set up a rest centre will be made by the local authority, often at the request of the police or fire brigade, that should say. How did you distinguish in your mind at the time between a survivor reception centre and a rest centre?
So I didn't think in terms of survivor reception centres. I thought in terms of there are people being evacuated, there will need to be rest centres. So my focus was around the rest centre part. I personally wasn't thinking of a survivor reception centre.
Why not? They're clearly different in the scheme. They're different in the LESLP.
So survivor reception centre, as we've established, a Metropolitan Police led. If they decide to do that, that is, as I've said, very much dependent on the scene and on what the police are dealing with and the circumstances. And I think we're looking here at pages that describe in nice, neat terms a variety of facilities. It's all guidance, it's all the good thing to do if you can, and in some incidences you have time to do all of them, in others the circumstances compress everything. So if we take, if you will humour me for a moment, sir, if we take a much lower key incident where there are people affected by an incident, there's an evacuation, it's not a huge number of people, it's not going to go on for days, there is time very often for a rest centre to be established over here. If the police want a survivor reception centre for a couple of hours, they may or may not do so, usually not. Later on, if there's going to be longer term community or humanitarian assistance centre, a few days later, there's the time to have put that into place. The scale and nature of this incident just compressed everything into one go. The survivors were also the bereaved, were also the community, were also the evacuated and the homeless all in one go. And that's actually quite rare. And I think that's what caught us all out on that particular occasion. If I go back to an incident in Kensington before I arrived there, but while I was still an emergency planner elsewhere, the Ladbroke Grove train crash, 31 people killed in that crash and several hundred injured. But it happened on a site which was contained. Most of the survivors got themselves out and came up the banks. There were spontaneous community-led receptions, if you like, on either side, the Sainsbury's Cafe on one side and a school sixth form centre on the other. Nobody opened those spontaneously dealt with. Most of those people, if they weren't injured, then disappeared. They either went to work, believe it or not, or they went home, back down the line to Cheltenham. They were not local residents. So there was no formal survivor reception centre because they weren't there to be fitting for it. There was no formal emergency rest centre because there was no population evacuated. The assistance that was there, that was provided, was fairly low. And the main job for the local authority, I believe, afterwards was sort of liaising with other local authorities about sort of ensuring people could access their local services for ongoing humanitarian support. So there was no humanitarian support centre, a vastly different set of circumstances. And with all of these things, incident by incident, we have fantastic guidance that says in an ideal world, all of the various things you can do. I don't think, now I'm talking now as an individual professional, not as a previous employee of the borough, but as somebody that's been in the profession. When I look at what happened at Grenfell and the sheer awfulness of that, and the fact, as I say, the survivors were also the bereaved, were also the evacuees, were also the homeless, were also the community, and the impact around that of that scale. This is the neatness of these arrangements, and you'll put this here, and you'll put that there, and you'll put this over here 3 days later on. It all got compressed within that. And I think going forward, my hope is that there is now recognition of London that there are the potential for this type of incident which hadn't been planned for to that level before. I question, as I did after the event, and I still question today, if it's still the case that the welfare support for people in this type of incident is dealt with initially by one local authority. Why do we not now have sub-regional teams trained and on call to come in at the word go? Because the concept that a 1/33rd sliver of London's local authority resource should be expected to respond to and manage capably that level of disaster clearly has been exposed as completely ridiculous. And I don't know now whether that has been picked up in London properly. I hope this inquiry will push strongly for a look and approach for that, because this plan looks great. It is great for a lower key incident, but on the day, everything was so compressed there that fantastically local venues, before we could even get around to the phones, were just opening up as shelters and were providing that support. But we did end up later in the day, I wasn't there at the day of course, but I'm aware that during the day at one point the Survivor Reception Centre concept seemed to be operating in the main rest centre. That should never happen by the book, but I think belatedly that sort of thing was happening. Humanitarian Assistance Centre seamlessly came in through the longer term emergency rest centre. There wasn't by the book this nice separation of discrete parts of that process. And I think we do need to just understand that in the context of what happened.
Well, the reason I asked my question is because the answer you gave us yesterday was that it was the Metropolitan Police's responsibility to set up whatever it was that was set up. What was set up? Were they survivor reception centres, or were they rest centres? And the reason I ask is because according to this guidance, the responsibility, the initial responsibility for setting them up is different, depending on what they are.
Yeah, my understanding is that the venues that did open up spontaneously in the community to bring people in, I would look at those as emergency rest centres. Survivor reception centre implies the police there meeting people, recording information and taking information. My understanding is that the various centres that did open were providing that shelter and support for people in need.
Right, and therefore, if it was an emergency rest centre, it would follow that it was the local authority's responsibility, at least according to this guidance at 8:15, to set it up.
And I'll try again and give a bit of context, if you'll humour me to do so. The book says, yes, a local authority would open up a rest centre. Where you've got time, particularly if there's a pre-planned evacuation or if there's a bit of time, a local authority can come in advance first. In my experience, it is the local community who actually open up first before the local authority can get there, because the community is on the doorstep. We had that at the Adair Tower fire. Although I actually put a council-established rest centre on standby and the staffing for it, the community had already opened up a place, and that was an appropriate and safe place for people to be. And my knowledge of the Grenfell Tower matter is that during the course of that Wednesday, the 14th of June, the local authority did start planning and putting into place with Westway what became the definitive consolidated emergency rest centre. But one would never come along to community centres and simply say, oh, you're not the local authority, you're not there, everybody must now come to here. The community is fantastic, the first responder. And again, it's the difficulty of a printed page that suggests you have the responsibility, therefore did you do it or not? The reality is that rest centres in the community will almost certainly, in most incidents, be opened first by the community. Right. And the local authority will either come along and say, for the small duration of a small incident, that's great and fine, or in a longer incident will then start organising a more appropriate rest centre for the longer term, and then persuade people to come from those other community centres into the established one when it has been established.
Now, you give me two very, very long answers, very rich and detailed and interesting, and thank you for that. But in short, do you consider, based on what you've just told us, that in the resilience field at the time there was confusion regarding these terms, rest centre, survival and reception centre, and indeed other centres?
I'm not confused. I don't believe my colleagues were confused. We understood that the Survivor Reception Centre was a centre established by the police for mainly their purposes of evidence of who was around and getting information about that they might pass through onto the Casualty Bureau. I am quite clear we were aware that an emergency rest centre was not about survivors just as survivors. This was the provision of temporary shelter from the elements and the first parts of some humanitarian assistance at quite a low level. And I'm quite aware that we were all aware that a longer term humanitarian assistance centre, which by the book would be in 2 or 3 days hence, by the time of which the longer term humanitarian needs had been identified and resources could be lined up from a multitude of agencies to come through.
Now let's go to a slightly different topic, or back on track perhaps, with the initial deployments. And if we go back to Rbkc 3013296, this is your typed emergency event log sheet. And if we go please to entry number 5 at the foot of page 1, this is your conversation with Mr. Leighton at 3:01, and he told you that Belushi's Bar, which I think you've recorded as the Belusius Hotel, rather grandly.
Well, that's the name I was given, I thought.
Yes, I can understand why you've written it the way you did. Had offered to give shelter to 100 people, and the Metropolitan Police had 2 buses on site to take people to alternative accommodation. You see that?
Yes.
And also, if we turn the page to entry number 6 on page 2, you say that I telephoned the Belusius Hotel, spoke to Ryan Teggin. I confirmed we would accept his offer of being a rest centre. You see that?
Yes.
And then on item number 7, just a little below that, I telephoned the British Red Cross emergency duty officer, John Putner, and asked for his British Red Cross support at the rest centre at the hotel. This was agreed. Why did you consider it appropriate for Belushi's Bar to be used as a rest centre, given that it wasn't on the list annexed to the contingency management plan, as indeed it wasn't?
The plan with the premises that we pre-identified were a resource to call upon if they were available or appropriate, but we would use anywhere appropriate as a rest centre if it was immediately available to provide that first shelter. We had done that in as I've described in other incidents. We weren't fixed to, we could only use the ones in the plan. This hotel had made itself available, and it was immediately available, and therefore it was the quickest way of actually having some premises open rather than starting to go through and starting to phone through and other people then getting key holders out and going through. So to me, it was absolute common sense to say, thank you very much. Here is a community offer. There is some transport available. It's immediately available. It provides those basic shelter elements, and I can deploy a team to it. Right. It was just common sense.
Now, it wasn't contained in Annex 15 of the CMP.
Oh, no.
So was it the practice that you would use those which were identified in the annex, but also anywhere that offered their support immediately?
Yeah, we would use anywhere that might be appropriate. The value of the annex, because we then knew that those premises, what they were and what their capacities were and their accessibility were, all that type of thing, meant that if we had an opportunity, there was time to nominate a rest centre, usually before evacuees had gone anywhere, then with the police we might say, yes, we'll get in touch with the whatever, we'd ring them up and do so. That's a more slower paced type of evacuation. That's more your block being evacuated because there's been a fire in one corner and everybody else is now on the street outside, and we've got a couple of hours to do that. However, anywhere that's appropriate. On a subsequent incident that I dealt with on the scene post the fire, we had a fire in some housing association flats, early hours of the morning. Around the corner was a hotel, the Hilton Hotel up in Holland Park Road. That was around the corner. A quick word with the manager was, yes, we have the room, the space here, and that was the most appropriate place to put evacuees in. Right. Now, I could have gone to the annex and we could have found somewhere, down the, whatever, and then waited to get key holders out. So common sense says if you've got somewhere which is open, use it. This was open, they were offered, thank you very much.
Now, apart from the Red Cross volunteers, no one actually attended Belushi's Bar, and in the end it was closed.
Yes.
Because it was too far away. The question is, how come it got opened as a rest centre to start with? And is that, as you've described, simply it offered its services?
It offered its services. Right. I mean, he wasn't that far away, but I could imagine if I was a resident, I wouldn't be straying terribly far either.
No.
So it was there, and there was some transport. So exactly as I described, it was the sort of decision I would have made at other times and made subsequently to use what was available.
You also decided, is this right, to close it? It was your decision, was it?
It was my decision. When I got information that nobody was going there, and by that time I'd heard that other community area centres were opening and people were at them, it's like common sense again says, responds to the situation that's in front of you at the time.
Yeah. Now, sticking with the document on the screen in front of you, looking at entry 100337, telephone call from Lalo Nick Leighton following a silver meeting at the scene, and then you can see that there are fatalities, and then underneath that, Harrow Club in Preston Road had offered to be a rest centre. You see that?
Yes.
Again, is it right that the Harrow Club had opened of its own accord, not
yes.
by Rbkc? Right.
At this point, if I can say, all of the centres in the community that opened in those early hours opened spontaneously. I didn't call any of them because I became aware that all of these centres were opening.
Right. Now, according to the BRC log, 2 minutes before, 10 minutes before this call, you contacted the British Red Cross and requested volunteers and indicated a second rest centre was due to be opened because of the scale of the incident.
Yes.
Yes. Now, we know that the Harrow Club is a set of premises in Annex 15 of the Contingency Management Plan.
Yes.
We can look at it if you like.
No, it is, yes.
It is. Is it the case that there were agreements in place with each of the organisations identified in Annex 15 to provide rest centres, which
Yes.
included Harrow Club and the Clement James Centre. Yes.
Yes,
And those
yes.
were oral agreements. They were.
Yes, those were Keith Robbins visiting those premises,
Yes.
talking to them, getting the agreement, doing an assessment. He would do an assessment for their suitability as to whether they would be suitable to be a rest centre. So that means access, the amount of space, are there toilets of sufficient number and things like that. And then getting the names and the telephone numbers of the key holders who would agree to be called should they need it.
Right. Did Rbkc provide any additional support or training to enable the premises listed in Annex 15 to fulfil their role as rest centres?
No, our view of their role was to be the premises managers, to open them, to be responsible for the heating and the lighting and put the urn on, and we would put the British Red Cross staff in to do the staffing from the rest centre part. That was the two parts that we would have done for that plan.
You say put the urn on. Is that for tea?
Oh, yes,
Right.
all of these places had a kitchen, so, it's like, the first thing you do is put the urn on and get the kettle boiling.
Right, okay. Right, thank you. So is it the case that so far as personnel training is concerned, you would rely on the British Red Cross under the MOU
Yes,
to provide trained rest centre staff?
yes.
Right. Then let's turn on in time to the first SCG meeting, the Strategic Coordination Group meeting at 5 a.m. And I think you attended that by telephone.
Yes.
And correct me, it's right, isn't it, that the Strategic Coordination Protocol allows for varying levels of multi-agency coordination,
Yes.
and an SCG meeting is the highest level?
Yes.
Yeah. And do you agree that to fulfil its role, a core function of the SCG is to create and maintain a shared situational awareness?
Yes.
Yes. And it also, I think, is the case, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that the maintenance of shared situational awareness can help the coordinating group get ahead in a crisis and exert greater control under in an unfolding and complex situation.
Yes, that's certainly the concept.
Now, if you tell us in your statement, and I don't think there's a need to go to it, it's page 16, paragraph 68, that you were notified by telephone at 04:35 of the first SCG meeting in relation to the Grenfell Tower fire to take place at 5 a.m, and that's on your typed log. If we go to page 4, could we just pick that up while we go? Page 4, and there it is.
Oh, yes.
Yes. At item 20, entry 20. Who did you understand was required to attend the SCG meeting from Rbkc?
So, if we'd had, by that point in the town hall, Gold, then Gold would have attended that meeting, and hopefully Silver would have listened in. I think at that particular point, I cannot remember whether I discussed that with Stuart or Priestley or not. Obviously, it goes on to show that I did attend that meeting on behalf of the authority.
Now, you were already in touch, as we can see from the previous entry 19 at 04:33, with Nicholas Holgate, Town Clerk and Chief Executive. Did you ask him to attend, given that he was or would be Councillor Gold?
No, I didn't.
Why is that?
Do you know, I don't know. Clearly I didn't. I'm happy to accept that I didn't ask Mr. Holgate to do that. I'm sitting here in the cold light of day. There is a logic that would suggest I should have phoned him and said, Mr. Holgate, there is this meeting, please attend it. I didn't, possibly because Mr. Priestley and I were the people that were absolutely fully involved at that particular point and would be better able to feed information to or listen to information from the group. But, you know, honestly, I can't say why I didn't phone him at that point. I suspect it didn't occur to me to phone Mr. Holgate at that particular point because of the way in which I was dealing with the incident at the time.
Now, let's look at the minutes for the meeting. At LFB 3061273, please. and that's the first of 3 pages, and we can turn, you can see the time of the meeting, but we can turn to page 2, and it goes straight in after any urgent business and introductions. See attendee list for more details, and the attendee list is on page 3. Let's quickly have a look at that, and you can see who was there, and you can see that you can see who was there from the LFB, but you can also see who was there from Rbkc, you and Stuart Priestley, and Mark Sawyer, who was from London Resilience. Yes?
Yes.
He looms large a little bit later in the story. I think it's right, isn't it, as you told Project Athena, that you joined at 5:07, a little bit late, because you'd been on the phone to the Lalo at 5 o'clock.
Okay.
Right. Now, if we go to page 2, please, of this document, under situation brief, and if we scroll down to the middle of that chunk of text and look at paragraph 3.8, shelter and care, including access to medication to be provided for evacuated people, Rbkc adult social care arrangements to be developed, 2 rest centres open, further 3 premises to be open to shelter people, likely to consolidate later in the morning. Do you know who said that during this meeting?
I don't know who said that. It would either have been Stuart Priestley or me. I don't know who said that. So
Right.
I don't think I've noted.
But it would have come from one or other.
It would have come from either Mr. Priestley or
Yes.
from me. It wouldn't have come from Mark Sawyer. He wouldn't have known that.
He wouldn't have known
He wouldn't
that,
have had that
no.
knowledge.
No. Now, we've heard about the 2 rest centres so far, Belushi's and the Harrow Club. Were those the 2 rest centres that you or Mr. Priestley said were open, as is identified there in the second line of paragraph 3.8?
May I check my log of that meeting, please? My log entry of that meeting.
Yes, we can go back to that. If we can go back, please, to the log at RBK 30133296, page 5. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Page. Yes. Page. It's just jumped.
It'll be
Page
the
6.
next page.
Page 6. Entry 28.
No, I was wondering whether I had noted in there the names of the centres involved, and
No,
clearly I don't.
You haven't, which is why I'm asking you. Do you remember? Can you confirm that the 2 rest centres identified in the note at 3.8, if we can go back to that, please, page 2 of LFB 000061273, page 2, thank you. At this stage, 5 a.m.
I cannot confirm the names that we may have given at that point.
Right.
Clearly, I've mentioned something, but I'm sorry, I can't recall what particular centres I referred to at that point.
Well, so far we've covered Belushi's and the Harrow Club. The further 3 premises to be opened to shelter people, which were they at that stage?
I'm really sorry. If I haven't got a written note of it, I certainly haven't got it in my memory at this point.
All right. Would you agree, though, that the reference to up to 5 locations as rest centres would indicate that that significant resources would be required to support them?
Yes.
Yes. After the meeting, if we go back, well, actually, we won't see this in your log, so to anticipate your question, it isn't there, and it's not in your statement. But we do have something from Toby Gould. Can we go to LFB 000061268? And Toby Gould was there as one of the attendees from the London Resilience Group. He was on page 3 in the attendance list that I showed you. Here's his statement. If we go to page 6 in his statement, please, paragraph 17, he says that in the third line, at 05:37, I spoke to David Kerry, Rbkc, about Rbkc's response, including that their chief executive would participate in the 06:30 SCG in person at the MPS Special Operations Room, SOR, or would dial in at his discretion. I subsequently emailed David Kerry with the details for the 0600 LRCG teleconference. And he goes on about the details of that. Now, do you remember speaking to Toby Gould at that time, 0537? As I say, it's not in your log, it's not in your statement. He recalls it.
I can't record it. I'm entirely happy to accept his statement, but I apologise again, but there was a vast amount going on at that particular time, and I really regret that if I don't have the written note of it, because phone calls were coming in backwards and forwards, I wasn't noting every single thing. I apologise for that, but it's a fact. If Toby says this in his email, I'm entirely happy to, in his witness statement, I'm entirely happy to accept that.
Now, if we go to paragraph 20 of his statement on page 7, a little lower down, he says, I also spoke to David Kerry, who confirmed that the Rbkc chief executive would dial in to 0630 SCG. And he sent an email to Matthew Hogan and the LRG team confirming that. Do you recall that?
I don't have the memory of it. I'm entirely happy to accept that that would have been a phone call that I got. I'm not sure from the timeline of this whether I was still at home or whether I was at the town hall at that particular time. But certainly I'm happy to accept that this was being discussed and talked about.
Okay. Now, the minutes of the next SCG meeting. So we've had one at 5. The next one is at 6:30. Let's just look at the minutes to that. It's at MOL 6015. I'll show you the first page, and then I'd like you to look at page 3 of it. There's the first page. You can see the time, 6:30. If we can go, please, to page 3, you can see the list of attendees there. Toby Gould's there again from LRG. We've got you again and Stuart Priestley, but also the coroner now on the call or at the meeting. But no Nicholas Holgate.
No Nicholas Holgate.
No. Do you know why?
No, I don't. Again, I'm sorry. At that point, I was definitely at the town hall. I had relinquished Councillor Silver, that was now Stuart Priestley, and I was acting to advise to him and setting up logs that nobody used and things like that. I'm afraid I have no idea what the circumstances were with Mr. Holgate at that particular point.
Right. Now, by this time, this is 0630, you were at the town hall, you'd set up the BEC, well, the BEC had already been set up, but you had produced the key, opened the cupboards, and got the kit up and running, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And presumably is this right? It was running smoothly so far as you were concerned at that point?
At that point, I wasn't aware of any technical problems, and Mr. Priestley and I would have been in an adjacent room for a teleconference. Now, I've got to tell you, I can't remember off the top of my head whether we both sat there and listened to it together or whether we were in separate places. Clearly, we were both listening in on the meeting. And
if you go back to page 2 of this note or minute, please, you can see that it says under item 7, recovery. Recovery issues will be discussed internally at Rbkc. An update should be available at the next SCG. The humanitarian assistance process will be established within Rbkc with the possibility to open an HAC at some point. That's the Humanitarian Assistance Centre. They will seek advice from Andrew Meek if required. Do you remember who said either of those things there? Was it you or Stuart Priestley?
I don't remember which of us said it. I expect it likely that Stuart did, but I can't rule out that I did. I'm sorry, I can't remember. At that particular point, just hammered dealing with things, and I am afraid that afterwards, if, I can't recall the detail of everything. I'm really sorry about that, but that was just the circumstances.
Yes, I understand. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Kerry, we'll take the morning break at that point. We'll stop there. We'll come back, please, at 11:30. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room.
Thank you.
All right? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. 11:30.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would you ask Mr. Kerry to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Kerry.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Now, the transition to Mr. Priestley, he took over from Silver at about 7 o'clock, according to his recollection. Would you recall the same?
I think it was earlier. My recollection is that Mr. Priestley was Silver when I arrived at the town hall, which was just before 6 o'clock.
Right. His recollection is that he took over at 7. You think it's earlier?
My belief is that he was Silver that when I arrived, and that I then went into the advisor role.
Right, let's look at his statement then, please, if we can. At RBK 3035672, this is his first statement. And if we go to page 6, paragraph 24, it's got a long statement. He says that between 6:30 and 7 he had a meeting with you, Nicholas Holgate, Laura Johnson and Robert Black. And then he says, David Kerry, as Council Silver, gave an update as to what had been fed back to Beck, which was still him at this point, from the on-site Lalo and via various teleconferences he had dialed into. Robert Black reported on his first-hand experiences having been at the site earlier in the morning. This was brief in nature, that he had attended the site, the building was fully alight, people were in the street and that blue light services were attending. Nicholas advised that he'd spoken to the leader and that we had a blank chequebook to fund anything we required in response to the fire. Nicholas confirmed that the priority should be to offer support to those directly affected, food, shelter, clothing, money, emotional support and emergency accommodation for those displaced. David advised Nicholas of the mutual aid agreement via London Gold and of the other local authorities' CEOs who could support him. Nicholas indicated that the decision to invoke London Gold mutual aid would be considered when the council's response was deemed insufficient. And it goes on. On what I've read you so far of that paragraph, is that in general an accurate account of what happened at that time?
I'm happy to accept that, yes.
Right. Did you have a handover?
Person to person, there was no written formal handover,
Right.
but having arrived, and clearly I've already been slightly woolly because of my recollection of when did I actually give over Silver or not, but certainly it was in person, talking with each other. It wasn't a written handover.
If you go down the page, to the foot of the page, please. If we can scroll down, you can see paragraph 27, which I put to you earlier, but he says, at approximately 7 a.m, David and I met and he provided a brief verbal handover to me as Council Silver. We agreed he needed to remain in the town hall to provide support until such time as other officers arrived. Do you agree with that?
I know it's not quite what I said a moment ago, but I am happy to accept this. If that's Mr. Priestley's recollection, I'm happy to accept it.
And do you recall anything of the handover? Do you recall what you told him? Key points to bear in mind?
I can't recall as such. I know it will have been the ongoing conversations we've been having, and I would have updated him about any information I might have had at that point if we hadn't talked about it already. But I mean, it was a sort of a fairly seamless transitioning in. It wasn't, I'm here, he's there, now we change over. This was all part of a transitioning, continual process.
Right. Now, let's turn to rest centres. If we go, please, to Stuart Priestley's log. This was his log. We looked at it yesterday. Rbkc 13318. And we can see that it starts at 3:10. And if we go to page 2 in it, at the time mark 7:30, about a third of the way down your screen, he says there that it was... there was a handover meeting from David to me, brief update in regards situation on ground, who and where Lalos are, rest centres, Rugby Portobello Trust, Harrow Club, Clement James Centre, Westway Sports Centre and other locations in the area, such as small churches. Just pausing there, is that something you told him?
That certainly looks like the sort of thing that I would have said
Very
to
good.
him.
Little information as to who is present and none have been opened via the council's EPT processes. And again, is that something you told him, do you think?
I can certainly imagine that. That's the sort of thing I would have told him.
Need for rest centre managers to attend the centres and provide management. David advised that LBHF can provide a rest centre manager. issue of insufficient number of Beck officers discussed. Again, did you remember saying that to him?
I don't recall it as we're sitting here, but I'm entirely happy to accept the statement that's written there.
Very good. And it agreed we would need to seek volunteers from across the policy and partnership unit. Do you remember that?
Sitting here today, I don't remember it, but again, I'm entirely happy to accept it.
But that's volunteers, is this right, within Rbkc, or was this?
Yes, the Policy and Partnership Unit was the wider team title of the team that Tony Redpath was director of, and which we were within, and there were a number of sub-teams within that, and so that was our immediate access to people.
Right. Now, it's right, I think, as we've seen, that the British Red Cross had already contacted you at 5:30 when the decision to close Belushi's was made, asking where the rest centre managers were. Do you recall that request? The first one was at 5:30. We saw that before.
Again, I really don't wish to be sitting here saying I can't recall all the detail. All I can tell you is that I'm happy to accept what is people's logs, because for that morning, incredibly tired by then and all sorts of things going on. And, you know, the last thing I want to do is sit here saying I don't recall. I just have to ask you to accept that I'm very happy to accept other people's statements unless I see something that clearly doesn't agree.
Right.
But there is a lot of detail of that morning that I just cannot remember.
Very well. Let's go then to BRC 6051, which is the BRC log, pages 4 to 5. We saw these before, just to pick the point. And you can see at the very foot of page 4, 5:30, checked in with RW, and still nobody at the rest centre, contacted Beck at Rbkc and advised nobody at the RC, suggested it was too far away, community reluctant to leave area. Decision made by RBKS to close this centre, and the BRC team were directed to the Harrow Club to assist there, asked where RC managers were, but did not get an answer. Now, that's what this records. Do you accept that?
I accept John's log. I don't recall it, but I absolutely accept it. If he's put it in the log, I totally accept it.
Right. Were you surprised at the time, do you think, that there was a request for rest centre managers from the BRC?
Again, I don't recall the incident. I wouldn't be surprised at that request because I think that's something that I would expect them to make. So, again, I'm happy to accept what the log says.
Yes. Was it clear to you in general terms that you had a shortage of rest centre managers, which is reflected in this document, but also in the Priestley log we looked at?
Yes, I have some sort of recollection of standing in the Beck at around about that time, and we were talking about Hammersmith and Fulham, by borough colleagues being asked to provide rest centre managers. Now, I can't remember the specific detail, and I don't know what the action of that was, but I have a recollection that we were certainly focused on seeking, under mutual aid from next door, their rest centre managers.
Did you go out and ask next door, as you put it, for...
No, I didn't. At that point, I think I was preparing to go into the teleconference,
right.
But...
Did anybody?
I don't know. We had Elaine Chamry, we had Anne Stewart in there. I don't know what the action of that was. Right. This was a very, very fluid situation at that point.
Was the provision for rest centre managers sufficient and sustainable over the days that then followed?
No, and even if we'd had 10 rest centre managers, that wouldn't have been sustainable over the days that followed. There would have absolutely been a need for mutual aid anyway.
Was that obvious to you from the outset?
I think instinctively I was aware, by that point, fully aware of the sheer scale of this. And, a common sense view would have been this is not going to be over and done with in a day or two. I was very aware that this was far bigger than we could deal with. And there's evidence later on, I'm sure you'll come to, when I said that at a later stage. But it was clear to me that we needed mutual aid in some of these aspects.
And is it the case? I would put it to you on the basis of the documents that it was clear to you at that stage by 7 a.m., certainly by 8 a.m., that the experiences of Grenfell so far had exposed the lack of capacity of trained Rbkc staff to deal with this emergency?
Yes.
Yes. Let's then turn to the second SCG meeting at 6:30. You and Stuart Priestley dialed into that. We've seen the minutes of this a moment ago, but let's go to it again. MOL 6015. And under any urgent business, you can see that it says St Mary's Hospital are receiving numerous affected people in search for support and accommodation. The hospital requires support from Rbkc to deal with these people, and the location and address of rest centre to signpost people. Rbkc to contact the hospital and to deal with this. Rbkc are in the process of consolidating their open rest centres into only one, which will be located at W11 1PZ. Now, first on the relation to hospitals, how did the information that St Mary's was receiving numerous affected people in search of support and accommodation come to the SCG?
I don't know, and their minutes doesn't say who made that report.
No, it doesn't. What was the established route? What was the norm?
Okay, in any event where people are casualties, I would expect the London Ambulance Service to be the primary organisation to deal with casualties and information for that. And in this instance, I would expect either the London Ambulance Service or the NHS to be the likely people that talked about what was happening at St Mary's.
Right. Do you remember what was done to action that?
I don't know, but looking at the minutes that talks about the consolidation of centres at W11 1PZ, that's not something that I was conscious of or discussing at that point, so I'm assuming that would have come from Mr Priestley, and I'm assuming that would have been dealt with by the BEC at that point.
Right.
Certainly I was not involved myself in whatever those discussions were.
Right. And it looks as if the hospital didn't know where and what the rest centre was, and indeed nor did you, because you were in the process of consolidating the rest centres. Is that right?
Again, we're now talking about something here which somebody else was dealing with. I'm quite aware that I wasn't aware at that particular point of the actions that clearly the BEC or Mr Priestley or somebody was taking to talk about that consolidation. A very proper thing, by the way. But all I can say is that I don't know the answer to that. By this point, we're 6:30 in the morning. I was exhausted by then. I was sitting in, and I think at that point, although the log says that Mr Priestley became Council Silver, I think at 7 o'clock after that meeting, I think at that point I was very much more in the listening mode and supporting Stuart, because I was on the way to being done by that point.
Now, if we turn the page, please, to 3.5, page 2, paragraph 3.5, you can see just there that it says Rbkc are in the process of consolidating rest centres into one centre only. This will be located at W11 1PZ. Full contact details to be shared ASAP. There are 2 LALOs on scene. These will be relieved within the hour. Rbkc BEC is open and will remain so for the remainder of today. Rbkc Gold will meet at 11 today. In relation to full contact details to be shared ASAP, is that right? At this point, 6:30, the rest centres were being consolidated into one, but the details had not yet been decided on or were yet known.
Again, we're now dealing with a matter that I wasn't dealing with at that point, so I'm not able to answer.
Well, let's try something slightly different then. Can we look at your emergency event log? Let's have both up, because I think we need both. Rbk 3013296, page 8. If we can have that up, and at the same time, please, your handwritten log at Rbk 3060425. You can see page 48 in the document on the right-hand side of the screen. You can see in the certainly on the left-hand side, under Action Response Outcome, Consolidated Emergency Arrest Centre, 3 St Mark's Close, W11 1TZ. You see that address?
Yes.
Let's use that for the moment. Do you know who? The question I have is, who provided that address? Do you know?
I don't know.
You don't know.
As I say, we're now starting to deal with matters that I wasn't dealing with myself at that point.
Do you know what it was?
3 St Mark's Close, I think was a council building. I think it was some sort of centre. I may be wrong, and I believe it may have been in our annex for rest centre things, but forgive me off the top of my head now, I can't remember, but I do recognise St Mark's Close as being something.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm afraid I've given you the wrong reference to your manuscript, but I don't think it would help given your answer. Let's look then at the BRC call log, BRC 6051, please, page 5. You can see on that page at 5 the entry for 5:30 towards the top of the screen. It says SE arrived, directed to get people to come to the Harrow Centre. It became apparent that a spontaneous RC, rest centre, had opened at the Portobello Rugby Trust. SE attended and assessed how many people there, approx 50. JP returned to Harrow Club, MPS now present outside, and 2 MPS DCs assisting with registration. Were you spoken to by BRC, British Red Cross, about that?
No, I wasn't.
Were you aware of it in any way?
I wasn't aware of that.
You weren't. At 5:45, in the next entry down, it says, fed back above to the Beck and went to the RPT, contacted Beck again, decision made by Rbkc to move people from the Harrow Centre over to the RPT to be in one place and easier to provide support. Rbkc spoke to the RPT management to agree this. Do you know anything about that?
I think I was in the cab on the way to the town hall at that point.
I see. Well, you had left the house at 5:37, I think, and arrived at 6, so you were in the cab.
Yeah.
But you still had your phone with you. Were you involved in any of these decisions or discussions?
I was not.
So who would have been, do you know? Would it have been Stuart Priestley?
It was whoever was in the Beck at that time.
When you arrived, were you told that this was what had happened?
I cannot recall what I was told. I mean, I know I went to the Beck. I know we were dealing with the sort of the machinery. I know, but frankly, my mind is a whirl at that point, and I cannot tell you what I was told on arrival.
Right. Then, if you look at the next entry down, it says JP returned to Harrow Club at 5:55, and then lower below that, 6 o'clock. Three Red Cross staff arrive at Harrow Club, directed to RPT, and then at 6:15, BRC team now at RPT, and then at 6:30, most residents now at RPT, and then underneath that, at the 6:45 marker, Harrow Club now empty. Did you know any of that? Did you know that there'd been a shift from Harrow Club to RPT?
I don't have that awareness as we sit here, no.
Would you agree, looking at this at least, that the actual position was that the Rugby Portobello Trust, RPT, was, by the time of the 6:30 SCG meeting, the location in effect being used as the main or consolidated rest centre?
Yes, I accept what's in John Putin's log.
Right. But if we go on to the next meeting of the SCG, the next one was at 8:30. That's at MOL 6014. There's the first page, there's the time, page 3. Are you able to help us? It says under local authorities provided an update. 2 rest centres were set up in the early hours, and this is now reduced to 1 address, which will be available all day. Portobello Rugby Trust, 221 Walmer Road, W114EY. British Red Cross are in attendance. Yes. But we still see 100 persons are in attendance at Harrow Road Club and 150 at the Rugby Trust, a combination of evacuees and those affected by the fire. So what was the position? Was the Harrow Club open or being used, or was it not?
I, by that point,
You can't help.
was not running these matters. I obviously was in the building. I was assisting Mr. Priestley. I think I was listening in on this call, but I was not a part by this point of the people that were managing these matters and making these decisions.
Yes.
So I would accept what is in people's logs and minutes of meetings as an outsider at that particular point. I'm sorry I can't help you.
Right.
I'm sure there are others who can.
Very well. I mean, you are right that you were an attendee at this meeting because you're listed as such along with
Right.
Stuart Priestley on page 3, which I should have shown you, but you were there. But you can't help us, I think. Is that right?
I'm sorry, either because I don't have a memory, but I think in this particular one, this level of detail, I'm quite certain I was not involved in, which means that clearly people in the Beck or Mr. Priestley were engaged in that matter. And that, to my mind, means it is most likely that Mr. Priestley gave this information.
Right. And do you know the reason for consolidating residents into one rest centre, at least that being the plan?
I can make an assumption, because I wasn't a part of that planning, but I can make an assumption about good practice.
Now, you were, I think, getting exhausted, as you told us, by this
Yes.
point in the morning, and you told the Project Athena that at this point you were getting shattered and emotional, and you'd seen the TV.
Yes.
Yes. And I think you went into you say you went into an adjacent room to do the telephone conference.
Yes.
And you told the Project Athena interviewer that you didn't know what you were doing.
I think by that time I was both physically exhausted. I'd only had 2 hours sleep that night, and we were now sort of, several hours in. I was also getting quite emotionally affected as well.
Sure. Now, who was making the decisions at this point, such as the decisions that we can see in this part of this 8:30 SCG meeting that I've referred you to?
Well, I can't say for certain. Certainly Stuart Priestley by that time was Council Silver, so therefore would have been a decision maker. But at the same time, there were other people from social care and housing within the Beck. So I would expect that they would have been a part of that discussion. They were all senior people. So I can't tell you precisely, because I don't think I was not sitting in the Beck at this point, so
Right.
I can't tell you precisely. But, yeah.
Right, now let's go back a little bit in time then to the 6:30 meeting again, MOL 6015, page 2. And if we can look, please, at section 7 under recovery. We looked at this before, as you'll recall, and it says there that recovery issues will be discussed internally at Rbkc. My question is, do you remember whether there was a discussion between the 6:30 SCG meeting and the 8:30 SCG meeting?
I don't know.
You don't know. You don't know, or you don't recall?
I don't know.
Right.
So therefore, I wouldn't have been involved in that aspect.
Right. Now, the suggestion of opening an HAC and seeking advice from Andrew Meek, do you remember whose suggestion that was?
Certainly, I gave suggestion about who could help us on that. Andrew Meek was our London emergency planning guru, if you like, on humanitarian assistance, and had been very heavily involved in the development of the London Humanitarian Assistance Plan. And to my mind, he would be the go-to person to get advice about that.
And what plan would be used to establish that process? That'd be the framework document.
I would have expected the London framework documents to be the guide of that.
Right, and one can quote from that a facility is where bereaved families, survivors and anyone else directly affected by an incident can receive information and appropriate support from all the relevant agencies without need for immediate referral elsewhere. That's how HAC is defined. Is that what you had in mind?
Yes, and we are talking in that respect of the facility you would expect to be creating over the next couple of days to come in after that at that point. The Humanitarian Assistance Centre isn't something you would expect to establish immediately. That's what the rest centres are for and the ongoing support. And then the plan, the London plan, was that, over those couple of days, as the totality of the needs of people would be understood, you would then provide not only the physical premises, but you would also bring in the various agencies, local government, central government and others, so that the idea was that people would not have to go trotting to different establishments or phone numbers to get support, but the support would be there. So that's a longer term type of thing.
I think you would accept that the responsibility to set up a humanitarian assistance centre, or HAC, was the local authorities?
Yes.
Yes. And was this also a reference here, can you help, to identifying and appointing a HALO, Humanitarian Assistance Liaison Officer?
I don't know from this statement whether we were discussing literally that detail at that point. I suspect it was more that we were saying we're going to need to set up a humanitarian assistance centre. I don't have any recollection of us starting to talk about the granular detail of that at that particular point.
And what practical steps would be required in order to get a HALO in place?
For that, again, following the guidance from the central plan, would be seeking somebody at a senior level, a strategic manager, probably from a social care setting, who would provide a strategic lead and who would then form underneath them the relevant disciplines and people and bring those through to start populating a structure, to start identifying what needs were needed. And
you didn't have one readily trained within Rbkc? So
Not in Rbkc.
You would have to look at the tri-borough arrangements?
Yes.
Yes. Let's then turn to a different topic, which is the arrival of Rebecca Blackburn. And you say in your first statement that you believe that she arrived at about 7 a.m. That's paragraph 76 of page 17. Is that correct?
That's what's in my log.
Well,
I mean, again...
Right. Let's look at your statement. Paragraph 76, page 17. And that's where you say in the last sentence, she arrived around 7.
Okay,
that's the basis on which I'm just putting this back to you. And that's your own evidence. And now she says in her statement, paragraph 18, page 4, we don't need to see it, that she arrived about 7:20. Now, there may not be much between you, but is it right that on any view you saw her after the 6:30 SCG, but before the 8:30 SCG?
I would expect so.
Right. Do you recall providing her with an update?
Not a written update. I don't recall whether I had a conversation with Rebecca or not, or whether Stuart Priestley had the conversation or not. I simply don't recall.
You don't recall. Now, her recollection, let's do look at this, please. It's her statement, RBK 3035364, page 18. Sorry, page 4, paragraph 18. It's her first statement to the inquiry. And she says here at paragraph 18, she says, I arrived at KTH at 7:20. The Beck was already in operation. There were 15 to 20 people inside. I did not know most of them. I knew a David, Elaine, Laura Johnson and Anne Stewart. Some members of Laura's team were also there too. David came over to me and said we had 2, maybe 3 rest centres open and that the TMO were on scene. However, nobody from Rbkc was at the rest centres. Mike and Nick Layton at the other LALO were at the scene. Now, is it correct that you told her that Rbkc had 2, maybe 3 rest centres open?
Now, I don't recall the conversation. Again, it's the sort of thing that I probably would have said, so I'm happy to accept this statement.
Right. Now, she goes on to say in paragraph 19, in the middle, the third line there, middle of the paragraph, David did not know how many rest centres were open and how many people were at each. He said that the Red Cross were at 1, but confirmed that no borough staff had been deployed. Therefore, the first people that the survivors met were Red Cross staff and local councillors.
I think that is a likely situation at that time.
Right. And is it right that although the TMO were at the scene, nobody from Rbkc was at the rest centres, apart from the LALOs?
I think that likely to be the case.
Yes. Was there a discussion as to what her role was to be, and in particular, her role after you left?
No, I can't recall whether they had a discussion or not. My expectation would be that she would carry on doing what I was doing by that point, which would be the emergency planning advisor to Council Silver, and therefore the emergency planning professional in the room that would know our systems and other plans.
Right. If we turn the page in Rebecca Blackburn's first statement to page 5, paragraph 20, she says, at around 7:45, David told me that he was planning to go home soon. He had been up from 2 a.m. and needed a rest. He asked me to join the Strategic Coordinating Group SCG meeting at 8:30 and then continue as the Beck lead for the rest of the day. I questioned why I should be the lead, since I had just arrived and I was not a senior officer. This meant that I lacked decision-making capacity. He simply replied that I would be the lead. He told me that he had not called out any further Beck officers. He did not see the need to disturb others since they would be coming into work shortly. Now, is it right that you did insist that she be a Beck lead, despite her protest that she wasn't a senior officer?
I have no recollection of the conversation, but I don't dispute that a conversation obviously took place. I can make an assumption that at that point, if that's what I said, the reason would have been that she would have been the person best placed to know what the Beck was doing and to be able to lead on that. So I can see a logic to that. Right. But I regret I am in a bit of a whirl at that point of the morning in terms of my memory later on and my memory today. I don't wish to hide away from anything. I have got a problem remembering this. I was, exhausted by that point. I would have been saying all sorts of things. I hope they were professionally appropriate at the time. But the fact is, I'm sitting here today at a loss, not being able to absolutely confirm everything. I'm sorry about that.
Was Stuart Priestley still there?
I don't know whether he was in the room or whether he was out of the rooms doing something else. He was in the town hall at that point.
To whom would Rebecca Blackburn have been responsible in line management terms?
In immediate line management terms, I was her line manager.
Yes.
In
but
terms
as the Beck
of
lead?
As the Beck lead, that would have been to Stuart Priestley.
Right. So, even though if it is the case that she lacked decision-making capacity, as she says here in her statement, was that a problem, given that she could always obtain authority from Stuart Priestley?
I would think that would be appropriate. Yes, Stuart Priestley was the ultimate decision-maker there at that point, both as our line manager and also as the council silver.
Right. Was it the case that you hadn't called any further Beck officers in because you didn't want to disturb them, because they would be coming in shortly anyway?
I don't recall saying that. I'm not saying I didn't. Certainly I hadn't called other Beck officers in. I'd called in Elaine Chunnery as the start, and I think the intention probably would be, go from there afterwards. So I hadn't personally called in other Beck officers. By that point of the morning, we're talking now, 7:45? Well, actually, the common sense says that people would be arriving at work if they weren't already coming in because of this incident. So that kind of is a sort of I can understand why that might have happened. But I can't recall the conversation, but I'm absolutely not saying it didn't take place.
Yes. Rebecca Blackburn describes the Beck at that point as complete pandemonium. Is that a description you would align yourself with?
No. There's an awful lot of chatter, an awful lot of talk, people comparing information. You can walk into any situation and see something that might look like pandemonium. But there were an awful lot of people there who were, as we've seen already from the log of other meetings, were making decisions about consolidating rest centres and thinking about Halo. So I would say it wasn't pandemonium. Probably looked like it, though. It certainly would have been noisy.
Right. Now, I want to ask you some questions next about your contact with Nicholas Holgate. We've seen already that from your emergency event log that he phoned you at 0319, that's entry 8, and again at 0433, entry 19. Is it right that you were in telephone contact at that time, at an early stage in the incident?
On those two occasions we spoke that I've logged, yes.
Yes. Did you remind Mr. Holgate, either during those calls or at a later stage, of the need to keep a written record of his decisions and actions, both inside and outside meetings?
I don't have a recollection of saying that.
Do you know if... right, let's look at the contingency management plan. Rbkc 30 is 28631, page 42. This governs the role of the GOLD, Strategic Coordinating Group, GOLD or SCG, and lower down the screen it has a heading, Composition of the Strategic Coordinating Group. and you can see the chief executive is on it. And then underneath that, it says, in the second paragraph, the chief executive will chair meetings of the SCG. And then it says a minute taker logist should be appointed to keep a record of decisions taken at meetings and to keep a log of the actions and decisions of the chief executive outside of meetings. Do you remember whether you advised him or reminded him that anything he did, he should log?
I don't recall whether I did or did not say that.
Do you consider that as the emergency planning advisor and specialist in this field, and particularly the governor, if you like, of this plan, that you should have reminded him of that?
I think sitting here today, that sounds like a fair statement.
Let me try it slightly differently. It may be a fair statement sitting here today. At the time, did you expect him to be reasonably familiar with this part of this document, given that if there were a major incident, it would be him assuming the gold role?
Yes, because we had dealt with that in the gold training, and he would have received similar guidance and advice in the London Local Authority role, particularly as London Local Authority Gold Rota.
Now, we know that Mr. Holgate was at the scene before he returned to the town hall, and he tells us that in his statement at paragraph 20 on page 4. Do you remember, did you have any meetings or discussions with him before the 10 o'clock meeting that you refer to in your log and in your statement?
I don't believe so. But I may have encountered him at the Beck, because I think at some point he came into the Beck, and that would have been earlier on. If I was in the room when he was in the room, clearly we would have met and spoken. I don't have a particular recollection of that, but that might have been the case.
Right. Well, let's just explore that a bit further. You say you might have encountered him, but you don't have a recollection. Let's see if I can prompt it. Can we please go back to Rebecca Blackburn's first witness statement, please? That's Rbk 3035364, page 5, paragraph 21. And she says there, by 8:10, Nicholas Holgate and Tony Redpath were inside the Beck. David and I had a meeting with them. Do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree with that.
She says in her second statement, where she elaborates a bit more on that. Let's go to that. It's Rbk 58170, page 17. If you look at paragraph 14.9, 3/4 of the way down your screen, she says, I attended a meeting in the Beck chaired by Nicholas Holgate. I believe this was on the morning of the 14th of June 2017. Nicholas Holgate mentioned he'd received a phone call from the CEO at Southwark Council who dealt with the Lacknell fire with the offer of assistance. I recall that Nicholas Holgate told persons at the meeting that Rbkc was coping, that outside help was not required at that time. Do you recall that?
No, I don't recall a formal meeting in the Beck. I know that I was in and out and would have bumped into people, but I don't recall a meeting, and I don't recall those statements, so I must assume that I was not there.
Continuing on the theme of Nicholas Holgate, let's revisit the third SCG meeting, which took place at 8:30, the minutes for which we saw earlier this morning. If we can go back to that, please. MOL 6014, and I think I mentioned to you but didn't show you the participants page 5. If we can look at that, please. We can see that apart from you as the last entry there, and Stuart Priestley and Rebecca Blackburn, Nicholas Holgate was also present. I'm going to assume that that's correct unless you tell me otherwise.
I'm going to assume it's correct as well.
Do you recall whether this was a long meeting lasting up to an hour and a half, or was it shorter?
I've no idea at this point. I'm sorry.
Right. Do you remember what time you went home?
My log says that I departed the town hall at around about 10:20.
Yes. Which was almost 2 hours after this meeting started. Do you remember whether there was any period of time after the end of this meeting and your departure from the town hall?
No.
No. Right. Now, do you remember whether at this meeting any consideration was given to whether the Beck was being fully manned in the period of this meeting?
I don't have any recollection of that.
Right. And was there any discussion about who should be running the Beck during this meeting, given that you, Blackburn, Priestley and Holgate were all on it, or at it?
I don't know. I know that Elaine Chumley was in there, one of our trained people. I'm not saying that she would be running the Beck, but we'd certainly had a trained person of staff in there. I can't answer your question about who was running the Beck at that point.
Right. Right. Do you recall Elaine Chumley more than once coming into the room where you were having the meeting asking for help in running the Beck?
I don't recall at all. I'm not disputing it. I'm happy to accept that that was the case. I'm sorry, I'm in this stage where at this point I'm not really recalling.
Right. Rebecca Blackburn recalls that she wanted to assist Elaine Chumley, but you asked her to stay on the call or at the meeting. It was a call.
I say I don't recall it. I can accept that happened because Rebecca would be to be the continuum across the rest of the day. So I can imagine that from a structural point of view, that would have been an appropriate thing for me to say. Clearly, that meant that Elaine Chumley didn't get Rebecca's assistance. But I think at this point, if I said it at all, and I'm happy to accept somebody else's word for it, my logic would have been that she needs to be fully in touch because she's going to be dealing with this carrying on.
Right. Now, if we look back at what we looked at earlier, page 3, under the local authorities update, and we've covered this already, the SCG wanted to know, as you can see from you, where the rest centres were and how many people were at them. But do you agree that when Rbkc was asked for the update during that meeting, you looked to Rebecca Blackburn, who was left to answer the question? You don't remember?
I don't. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I just don't remember.
Do you know why there was no reference here to the other locations which had been opened spontaneously by the community by this time? For example, the Clement Janes Centre, the Latimer Community Church, the Notting Hill Methodist Church.
I don't know. I don't know if we were aware of that at the time. I'm sorry, I don't know.
No. And would you agree that the reference to the 100 people in attendance at the Harrow Road Club was not the current position because it had been emptied at around about 6:30 or before that?
If other people's records say that,
Right.
clearly I'm accepted. I don't know.
You don't know. And if we go back to we'll stick with the minutes at Action 8. If we go to the bottom of page 3, very bottom, it says, Action 08, MPS and Rbkc to confirm arrangements for friends and family looking for information. Do you know who it was from Rbkc who took charge of that?
No.
Now, do you accept one arrangement that could be utilised is a friends and family reception centre? We talked about survivor reception centres and rest centres, but there's something else, isn't there, called a friends and family reception centre?
Yes.
Yes. Let's just look at the definition of that so we're clear about what we're talking about. Can we go to the LESLP guidance document at RBK 3013294? Page 35. Paragraph 9.8. Friends and Relatives Reception Centre. And it says, where demand warrants it, consideration to establishing a secure, comfortable area where friends and relatives of casualties and missing persons can be directed for information. And then it identifies at 9.8.4 the purpose of a Friends and Relatives Reception Centre, or FF, or FRRC, to help reunite friends and relatives with survivors, to provide a place for the police to record missing persons inquiries and to collect information that may aid their investigation, to provide friends and relatives with a safe area to gather away from media attention, to provide friends and relatives with up-to-date and accurate information on the response arrangements that have been put in place, to provide access to practical and emotional support to those friends and relatives affected. Now, is that what you understood at the time as a friends and family or friends and relatives reception centre?
Yes.
Did you agree to establish one with the Metropolitan Police?
I have no recollection of that discussion happening. I'm not aware that there was a discussion about that.
If you go to page 70 of this document, there's a glossary. And at the foot of the page, you'll see a definition of Friends and Relatives Reception Centre, FRRC, and it says an FRRC is likely to be set up within first 24 hours of the incident occurring and should be a safe place for friends and relatives to gather where they can receive up-to-date information about the situation and response. What provision had been made up to this point, by which I mean 8:30 a.m. on the morning of the 14th of June 2017, for the establishment of an FRRC?
I'm not aware that there was anything in place at that time.
Why is that?
I think just the scale of what was going on. Again, slight context. As intended by all of the plans up until that Grenfell Tower fire, an FFRC was always envisaged as something entirely separate from an emergency rest centre, and particularly for incidents such as the July 2005 bombings in London and other matters. You very often in London, of course, get an event where there were people not from that locality but from many other parts, and friends and relatives might then from their communities come to find information about was their relative or their friend involved in this particular incident. So the purpose primarily of a friends and relatives centre was to say that's where we can, or the police can look at people there, and the police start recording information for the Casualty Bureau to add to the identification of people, and separate from the Emergency Rest Centre, which would be for the people evacuated from the particular incident area and may well be of a different community. We come back to that unique totality of the Grenfell Tower matter. I'm aware that later in the day, Family and Friends Reception Centre, I believe, was set up in the Salvation Army.
Yes.
And I think later on that might have even been subsumed into the overall centre at the Westway. Now, that wasn't by the book, by the way, because the book said you keep these things separate. But again, these are all guidances from which you can do your best under a particular incident to make that happen. I just think nobody was thinking of an FFRC at that particular point because, we had everybody was coming out to the rest centres. And again, we have this situation of the survivors also being bereaved, also being the family and the friends. Obviously, there are other family and friends from elsewhere. All I can say to you, Mr. Millett, is that I just think in the totality of what we were dealing with that early in the morning, that hadn't yet been a consideration.
Do you know anything about the establishment, or what came to be the establishment of the FRRC at the Salvation Army by about 3 p.m. that day?
That all happened after I had left the town hall for that day.
And what about the decision, do you know anything about the decision to set it up earlier? That there is some evidence from the police that they were told by Rbkc at just before noon that the Salvation Army would be the FRRC from 12:30. Do you know anything about that?
No, again, this was all after I had left the building.
Okay. Then let's then turn back to Nicholas Holgate. Can we go to your first statement, please? Your first witness statement, page 18, paragraph 81. And you say here that around 10 a.m. I attended a meeting with Laura Johnson, Robert Black of the TMO, Nicholas Holgate and Stuart Priestley at the town hall. That's right, is it?
Yes.
Yes. What was the purpose of that meeting?
It was a gathering in a room. It wasn't an agendaed meeting of that nature, so we describe a meeting, 4 of us met. My recollection is that it was Nicholas wanting to gather what is the latest state of play for matters because he was having a gold group meeting later on. Right.
And you say this was effectively a handover meeting for me and a pre-meeting before the council gold meeting.
Yeah, I was aware that I was there to say any last things I had before I left for the day.
And you left at 10:20, so this tells us that the 8:30 SCG meeting cannot have lasted longer than 10 o'clock, than an hour and a half.
Indeed.
Right. Now, and you say it was effectively a handover meeting for me and a pre-meeting before the council gold meeting. Go to your emergency log, please. Typed version, RBK30133296, page 9. We'll see the 10 o'clock time mark.
I think the next page.
Yes, you are right. Page 10. 10 o'clock. Meeting with David Kerry, Chief Executive Nicholas Holgate, Director of Housing Laura Johnson, Robert Black, Council Silver, Stuart Priestley. And if you look at the actions, it says Nicholas Holgate Council Gold Group to be convened later. This incident is bigger. This incident is bigger than any one local authority in London can manage, and consideration should be given to asking for mutual aid for the Beck. You see that?
Yes.
Was that your advice?
That was my advice.
Right. What led you to form that view and to give that advice at that stage?
The clear understanding that we didn't have sufficient Beck staff to be maintaining 3 Becks 24/7 for what was going to be an extended period, and that there would be a need to use mutual aid.
Now, you say in your statement at paragraph 81, lower down, we don't need to go back to it, that nobody at Rbkc had ever dealt with anything of this scale.
No.
And you also say in paragraph 104 on page 23, and again, there's no need to look back at it, but you say, I believe that none of the 33 LAs could have coped with the scale of the Grenfell Tower and the response on their own.
No.
That's right, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I believed that then, I still believe that today.
There's guidance about this, isn't there, in your CMP at Annex 10? And let's look at that. RBK 30-32334. And this deals with the mutual aid arrangements. If we go to that, this is RBK 30-32334. This is Annex 10.
Yes.
Dated 28th December 2016. So this must be right.
Still relevant, yes.
Up to date,
Yeah.
at the date of the fire. Go to page 4, please, paragraph 1.1. Background, planning assumptions, the need for mutual aid. And it says, in the third line, however, the scale or size of an incident may overwhelm certain aspects of the council's response, either people or material, and it may be appropriate to seek support from other local authorities. And it goes on. Mutual aid is most likely to be needed in the event of a long duration, when the resources of the local authority and its contractors have been exhausted, and when there is limited or no easily obtainable other resource. This might be a large-scale incident involving many council departments and services. It might be a single service issue where a particular resource or staffing skill is in very short supply. That's a fair summary of the matters to be considered, is it?
Yes.
Yes. And did you have that guidance in mind when referring to mutual aid when advising Nicholas Holgate at the 10 o'clock meeting?
Mutual aid was something that, from as emergency planners, was regularly discussed and exercised, and I didn't need to refer to the plan to remind myself of what mutual aid arrangements were. Mutual aid was often informal, but there was also a formality if needed. So in all sorts of events and incidents across London over many years, a local authority might need a little bit of assistance, and very often it was ringing your friends or neighbours or people you know that would do that. That was entirely informal, nothing to do with the London Gold Protocol or anything like that. That was just business as usual about mutual aid. For a London-wide situation, so for example in severe weather, national fuel shortages, winter gritting issues and what have you, where it might become necessary for a number of authorities to support a number of other authorities. You've got the more formal part, which is in the latter part of this annex, where the London Local Authorities Coordination Centre, the LAC, on behalf of London Local Authority Gold, could undertake the collection of who's got what and who needs it, and then divvying that through. That's the rather formal part, and you can bring that in. So mutual aid can start literally from the word go, if necessary, by speaking to your neighbour. It can develop, or it can become formalised later on. What was clear to me at that particular point was this is massive, and it's appalling, and we don't have the resources to deal with this. Nobody would have had, and that is exactly why we had mutual aid arrangements in London, well understood and well practiced.
And when you spoke of mutual aid in this context at 10 o'clock in the morning, on that morning, were you referring to seeking mutual aid from different local authorities on a piecemeal basis, or activating the London Local Authority Gold Resolution?
So I didn't say anything formally about activating the London Gold. I was at that point saying we need mutual aid. I think I identified 3 or 4 areas, and I named some people who I thought might be a good resource for the authority to speak to, because they were people who either got experience or were experts in those fields. So at that point, I didn't say activate the London Gold arrangements.
Did you have that in mind?
I don't think I had that in mind at that point. At that point, we're still right at the beginning of this. It is very much a responsibility of a chief executive looking strategically to determine these matters, and the training had been there, and the London Gold arrangements were all about that. I certainly knew we needed, or should be looking at mutual aid. I said that we needed mutual aid in certain areas. At that point, I didn't say that we needed formal London Local Authority Gold.
But was it not obvious to you by that point? This is 10 o'clock now, and you know there are fatalities, you know there are mass displaced people, you've already seen numbers in the hundreds. You've got at least, by now, 5 rest centres, or centres of some kind, in operation. Was it not obvious by that point that the London Gold Resolution should be triggered, as opposed to seeking mutual aid piecemeal from other boroughs?
Not in the sense, I understand you're asking me a very clear question. I didn't get that sense yet at that point of the full London Gold part. And that's what the Council Gold strategic meeting ought to have been considering later on. Because the purpose of a Council Gold strategic group is to look at what are the bigger issues, what are the resourcing needs, and if at that point that assessment had been made, they would have been able to trigger those points. My job in my last bits that morning were to give those last bits of advice. It was a quite short meeting, I think. I don't think I had much to say because Mr. Priestley would have been saying most of anything else. My bit really was a last gasp before I go, look, this is bigger than we can deal with. There are some particular areas. And at that point, that was my professional advice. The Council Gold meeting had the ability to consider just how much more might be needed. And from there were the routes if they needed it or wanted to do so. Now, those are Command's decisions that were taken after I was there and above my level. My level was to give the advice I gave. I'm clear I did give that advice. I didn't say activate London Gold because I didn't think in those terms at that point. And frankly, that wasn't for me to think at that level anyway. That was for Mr. Holgate to do so.
Now, you identified a number of names you gave. And they're listed in your log.
Yes.
John Barradell, who was the Chief Executive of the City of London Corporate and Chair of the LAP.
Yeah.
Eleanor Kelly, who was Chief Executive at
Southwark.
And Andrew Meek, who you've described already, who was at Haringey. What was the response you received to your advice that this incident was bigger than any one local authority in London could manage and consideration should be given to seeking mutual aid?
I don't have ever any recollection of what was said. I'm aware that Mr. Priestley did log a response. I don't have a recollection of what the response was.
Right. Did you form the impression that the senior management, Nicholas Holgate himself, was reluctant to seek mutual aid at that point?
I don't have any opinion about that. I think those were literally my last words, and I think at that point I left. I'm not even sure that the rest of the meeting had finished, but certainly I think that was literally my last, I'm out of the door here, and this is the last thing I'm saying.
Right.
Sorry.
Right. Let's look at Rbkc 30133318. This is Stuart Priestley's log again. And if we go to page 2, page. We need to. Well, it is on page 2, but I think we need to pick it up at page 1, at the foot. But this goes back earlier in the morning to 6:30, and the meeting in the Beck that you described earlier. If you go to the very foot of the page, he says, that's Robert Black, reported he had attended the site and it was very serious indeed. You see that? And then over the page, to page 2, very serious indeed. And then he says, Nicholas advises he has spoken with the leader who has agreed to fund anything necessary for the relief effort. David advised Nicholas of the mutual aid arrangements available via LLAG and our neighbouring boroughs. I'm just pausing there. Did you give that advice at that time, or was it at the 10 o'clock meeting, or both?
I certainly gave the very clear statement I gave at the 10 o'clock meeting.
Right.
And I remember that because that was my last before I left. This is one of these bits of this amorphous stuff in the back and all the rest of it. When it says a meeting, if it happened at all, which I'm sure it did, it would have been us standing around, not a sat-down meeting. This is one of those ones I absolutely don't recall. I accept somebody else's statement of that if they were there, but I don't have a recollection of talking to Nicholas and Robert in that room. I can remember very clearly Robert Black looking absolutely shattered at the 10 o'clock meeting. I'm not saying I didn't. I'm not saying I didn't say these words. I'm sorry. This is that part of my brain that's just not remembering things of that point.
It goes on. Nicholas, it goes on. David advised Nicholas of the mutual aid arrangements available via LLAG and our neighbouring boroughs. Nicholas stated, that looks like we can't cope. Do you remember that?
I've absolutely no recollection of that.
The conversation on mutual aid at that point ceased. Is that right?
I have absolutely no recollection of this discussion. I'm not saying it didn't take place. I just don't have a recollection of this discussion.
Do you have a recollection of an impression, at the very least, that in those early hours the concern at the most senior levels within Rbkc was that to seek outside help would look like a sign of weakness?
I don't have anything of that. I know I was talking about mutual aid. I don't have any remembered impression of negativity.
Okay. Well, I suspect I'll get the same answer, but let me keep trying. Can you think of any justifiable reason at the time, or any advantage for Rbkc in not seeking mutual aid, either at 6:30 or 6 o'clock a.m. or at 10 o'clock?
No, it was an absolute given in my mind that we were at the point where this is a massive disaster and we need mutual aid, and that's what the mutual aid arrangements are for. That's why I would have been giving that advice from word go. And you don't recall any pushback on that from Nicholas Holgate on the basis that it might look like Rbkc couldn't? I don't recall the meeting at all that took place in the Beck here. I don't recall the outcome of after what I said in the 10 o'clock meeting. I mean, I think I literally said it, and I think I was sort of up and out. I don't recall that. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but you'll have to ask Mr. Priestley and others about it. I don't recall.
Right, very well.
I'm desperately sorry about that, but I just don't.
Now, let's turn to a different topic, which is the deployment of Rbkc staff to rest centres. We've heard that the British Red Cross staff were sent to Belushi's Bar and then the Harrow Club. If we could turn to the emergency log the BRC maintained, it says at BRC 6051. If we go, please, to page 4, which is the 5:30 time mark, at the very foot of your screen, very foot of the page. We've seen it before. Asked, if you go over the page to page 5, last line in the entry, asked where RC managers were but did not get an answer. And then 6:45, contacted Beck. You can see, last item, contacted Beck trying to locate Rbkc Iarlo. It must be Lalo, I'd have thought. Is that right? I don't think I've heard of a Yarlow.
I'm sorry, which line are we on?
The last one, 6:45, contacted Beck.
I'm sorry, I beg your pardon.
Trying to locate Rbkc.
Oh, I would imagine that would be Lalo.
Or RC staff. And then 7:40, if you look down just to the foot of your screen, can we scroll down a bit more, please? Just have that there. 7:40, it says RW at RPT Trust as RC lead, still no Rbkc staff. And then at 8:15, if we turn, please, to the foot of the screen, Chaste Housing and Social Care advised on way. And then at 9:15, Chaste Housing and Social Care advised on way. And last overleaf, if you go please to page 6, 10:30, Chaste Housing and Social Care advised on way. Airwave terminals and EFA kit on site. So it looks, from this at least, that from 5:30 a.m., as I've just shown you, the British Red Cross made a number of requests to the council, spanning some 5 hours, for updates about when Rbkc staff would attend the rest centres to provide support. That's what the log shows. Do you accept that that is what happened?
I accept that log. I will repeat that I was not there after 10:20 at all. I was not in the Beck very much from the time I arrived. I was mainly out of the Beck in other rooms dealing with other matters. I wasn't running the Beck. I'm aware that we had people from social care and housing management were in the Beck. My assumption is from these logs that clearly they would have been involved in resourcing staffing, but I wasn't there. It's not something that I can answer for the simple reason I don't have that knowledge.
Right. Who was the person continuously in the Beck who was fielding or responsible for receiving this information and acting on it?
I don't know if that was one individual person. I know there were several people in the Beck. I've no idea, because I wasn't there, to say how that was actually being handled.
Right. Who ought it to have been, according to the structures and systems you had in place?
I would have expected from the systems and structures we had in place that any Beck staff sitting at their terminals and with their phones would have received calls and received emails, and then would have given that information to any others in the room that might have been involved in those operations.
Do you know when RBK staff were eventually deployed to rest centres?
I don't myself know.
Now, Rebecca Blackburn tells us in her statement that RBK staff from the Housing Department, from Adult Social Care and Children's Services were deployed by her to rest centres at about 10 a.m. Can you help with that, or were you?
No, it sounds like the sort of thing that might well have happened and sounds appropriate, but I don't know that because I wasn't there.
That's what she says, but you've got no reason to disagree.
I've got no reason to disagree, but as I say, I wasn't there.
Are you able to explain why RBKC staff were not deployed to rest centres earlier?
No.
Do you agree that they should have been deployed earlier, for example,
Yes.
at 6 a.m?
I think in hindsight, yes, absolutely, they should have been.
Yes. I mean, as a Category 1 responder and a local authority responsible for opening and operating rest centres, are you able to account for the delay in sending RBKC to personnel to rest centres so late?
I think a combination of the lack of trained staff in that role ourselves, the lack of getting in the mutual aid at that point, which we had already recognised that we could have done, and I think probably a little bit overwhelmed by the overall speed and the circumstances. It's not satisfactory.
Now, we've heard so far in this module evidence from family members desperate to find information about their loved ones with homes in the tower, that in the centres that they visited in the early hours and into the day of the 14th of June, they saw nobody from RBKC. Are you able to explain why not?
I can't. I am aware from a list that was compiled afterwards that we had at least 340 named staff working in the area in the day. I'm aware that there's a lot of criticism that they weren't visible as such. But look, I keep coming back to the fact that by that time in the morning I was no longer running this matter. And I was out, I wasn't there during the daytime. There were all sorts of activities that I'm sure other people have reported that were taking place during the course of that day. I can't answer you. I'm sorry, I was not there.
From what you do know, did the delay in deployment of RBKC staff to rest centres or centres, whatever they were, cause a vacuum of support which the local community and voluntary organisations stepped in to fill?
The local community organisations and voluntary organisations certainly provided support and succour for people at that particular point. In terms of information about loved ones in the tower, I find it difficult to believe that anybody would have been able to assemble that sort of information in that timescale with any certainty, given the nature of what was going on. Certainly, It would have helped had we had some senior managers earlier at those rest centres to be able to feed back and start to strategise the consolidation later on. But I am aware that from having seen other people's things subsequent to the events, that an awful lot of work was done during that day, whether there was visibility or not. But I think others, I'm sure you will be questioning in the course of this inquiry about those activities. I would feel much more comfortable about them representing what they did and when those happened than me trying to make some guesses here at this point.
Let me show you what Rebecca Blackburn says in her statement, please. Can we go back to it? It's Rbkc 3035364, page 5. If we go to paragraph 22, she says there. Indeed, it's the whole paragraph, but picking it up in the middle, she says, although I did not have decision-making capacity, I felt someone needed to take the lead. In the end, I decided to let the teams go around 10 o'clock. I think they should have been sent earlier, maybe around 6. After the teams left, I received an email about deployments. Sue Harris told us that the Westway Centre had opened as a rest centre. It turned out that the other rest centres were not set up by the borough, but by third parties. David left at around 10:40 a.m. Now, leaving aside the point of your departure, do you have a comment to make, or do you agree or disagree with what she says in the rest of the paragraph I've read to you?
Well, I wasn't there, so I can't agree or disagree with that. I can understand the sense of that. It certainly says there were senior managers from housing and social care and children's services involved. These are the sorts of level of people that you would expect to be taking decisions about finding and deploying staff for those roles.
And she says above that nobody in the BEC could tell her which rest centre had the most people. That made it difficult to match resources to need. Was that a problem that you were aware of?
I think I'm generically aware that that was an issue. A lot of community centres opening up, very difficult to know who was in them at that particular time. I believe that later in the day, much more information was coming in, and that enabled the consolidation at the Westway Centre.
Let's then turn to Office of Assistance and go back to Andrew Meek, who we've touched on earlier, and whose name was in the list of the names that you gave Nicholas Holgate at the 10 o'clock meeting. And in fact, he was also referred to at the 6:30 SCG meeting, as we saw that yesterday, or earlier this morning. Can we go, please, first then, in that context, to GOL 401055. This is an email sent by Toby Gould, if you look halfway down the email run, to Andrew Meek at 7:11 on the 14th of June. Toby Gould is London Fire, and he says, Andrew, thank you for your email. I note that you're on leave this week. David Kerry was going to call you re-advice on humanitarian assistance arrangements for the ongoing incident in KNC. Re the Southwark HASG, I'll be there this morning. Numbers and attendees have been limited so far as possible by the chair. Toby, now I'm not sure that the Southwark HASG has got much to do with it, but can you help with that, what that is relevant to? Or was that a different incident?
Oh, sorry, the Southwark Humanitarian Assistance Steering Group. I think, were they still dealing with the aftermath of the incident on London Bridge?
Right.
So I think that was the ongoing Humanitarian Assistance Centre from that.
Right. Now, it's not clear to us whether you were copied into Toby Gould's email to Andrew Meek, but you are copied into Andrew Meek's response, just above that, as you can see, yes?
Yes.
And that comes at 8:54 on that morning. Toby David, yes, on leave, but we'll take a call. I think I might have missed one, but didn't recognise the number. Andrew. Had you attempted to contact Andrew Meek at that time?
I don't have any recollection of doing so. I don't recollect this email. Again, it's obviously there. At that point, I don't recollect it. Certainly, I don't have any memory, and I have no log, I don't think, of attempting to phone Andrew Meek.
No, it's not in your log and it's not in your notebook.
No, so I'm quite happy to say that I didn't attempt to call Andrew Meek.
And given that it's Toby Gould who's writing to him first, can you help whether it was he who had contacted Andrew Meek?
Reading that email below, that infers that Toby and I must have had some contact with each other about that. I don't record it, but that clearly suggests that we had. So clearly I was still talking about that mutual aid.
Yeah.
Whether or not I said at that point, I'll make the call, I don't know. I imagine that I simply got swamped thereafter and probably left it that I had given the advice to Gold about the mutual aid.
Well, just piecing this together. In the second line there, it says David Kerry was going to call you re-advice on humanitarian assistance arrangements for the ongoing incident in K&C. Do you remember having a conversation with Toby Gould, Deputy Head of London Resilience, before 7/11 on the morning of the 14th?
I don't have a specific memory of this conversation about this matter. I was that morning fielding calls left, right and centre. It's entirely absolutely probable that Toby Gould at some point might have had a chat with me. I regret that this is, we're in that stage where I was doing stuff and I can't remember after the event now.
Now, Andrew Meek tells us in his statement that he didn't get in touch, or you didn't get in touch by the time of his 8:54 email, or the later emails. Let's look at the next one. At GOL 401052, we have another email, this time from Andrew Meek to Toby Gould, copying you in and setting out his immediate recommendations, as you can see. Now, just pausing there, did you have a conversation with either Toby Gould or Andrew Meek by this point? And I say this point, this is as I say at 10:23.
At 10:20, excuse me. At 10:23, I had either just left or was in the process of leaving the town hall.
And the immediate recommendations are FFRC as soon as pos, BBC reporting people wandering from centre to centre looking for loved ones, best to keep these people in one place with support. 2, appoint HALO and plan first HASG for the PM. 3, prepare for an assistance centre, assume many practical and emotional needs, some very complex. 4, use housing lists as basis for assessing individual needs. Appoint an information officer to maintain the record of who is affected and how. 5, mutual aid ? Andrew. Now, the email was copied to you, but as you say, you were in the process of leaving. I think according to you, you'd already left. Do you remember seeing this email at the time?
I don't recall seeing that email. I do recall that I think some of these issues were on the Gold Group meeting later that day, and I think some of those actions may have been taken. That's me seeing stuff after the event. I don't have a recollection of this. Clearly, that will have been in my email box, along with the hundreds of other emails, but I don't have today a recollection of that.
Now, Andrew Meek tells us in his statement, it's paragraph, it's page 2 of his statement, it's unparagraphed, but he says he received an automatic reply stating that you were no longer on duty for this incident. Got
good.
That at 10:23.
I did something right then.
Well, the question that follows from that is, did you share this information with anybody?
It sounds like I did the sensible thing by putting an out of office when I finished duty, and that would have been so that people didn't email me expecting them to pick me up. I can't remember, I expect, but I can't remember if that out of office then said forward your emails to the Beck, which would have been a sensible thing. Certainly if Toby Gould got an email from me saying I was now off duty, I would have expected him to make other contact with the borough.
Right. Do you know what steps were taken by you with respect to the recommendations Andrew Meek made here?
I think it likely that I didn't receive that as such. I had finished, I had set my out of office, so that I would have left that for wherever it then went.
But where?
Well, to the Beck, I would have expected.
But when you, let's just work this through. When you put your out of office on, did that tell the recipient to send their email to somebody else and provide the email address, or did that happen automatically?
No, it wasn't automatic. I would have set manually that out of office message, and I no recollection of what that out of office message was at this point. I'd be delighted to see it. My practice would have been, I hope I followed my practice, would have been to say where they should reroute the email.
Well, I was going to ask you, when you left to go, did you tell Stuart Priestley or Rebecca Blackburn to pick up your email so that you could collect any incoming information or advice such as this?
No, they wouldn't have been able to collect emails from my email box. I would have asked people to resend their email to the Beck at Rbkc, and the Beck would have picked that up.
Right. Now, we've heard evidence from Kerry Musilhi and Hissam Choukair, who were wandering around London desperately seeking information about their loved ones at this time. Why was no FFRC already established to help people in their position?
I don't know.
They should have been, shouldn't they? Would you accept that?
Again, in the guidance and the plans and the context which they put, an FFRC wouldn't normally have been something immediately. It would have emerged later in the day if a need for that emerged. We're talking here about an incredibly complex and compressed situation. Also, at an FFRC, by the way, it is very unlikely that the FRRC would have any information to give to a family or friend or a loved one. Their role for the police is actually to gather information which they can collate with the Casualty Bureau as part of the identification. So people will turn up in other incidents at an FFRC hoping to be told something. In actual fact, they were being asked information. It was very rare for an FFRC to actually have that information at that stage.
But wouldn't it be the case that if an FFRC was established and that information was broadcast, then at least people in the position of Kerry Musilhi or Hissam Choukair or Nabil Choukair would know where to go? There'd be a central point where they would know where to go, rather than wandering around London, checking from hospital to hospital and going in and out of the Westway.
Yes, is the answer. I'm sorry, my hesitation was because I'm thinking of the circumstances of the time and the timeline all that through. Absolutely yes. If somebody does come in and if there's an FFRC there would have been a person for those people to go to, and clearly there wasn't at that particular point. It came later in the afternoon.
The question is why? I mean, you got large numbers of desperate people, terribly worried about their family, looking at the building burning and having absolutely no means of knowing where to get any information, let alone get the information itself.
Information about casualties would always come from the Metropolitan Police as per the LUSLIP Major Incident Management Procedures, and the local authority would never be a disseminator of information about casualties. So in that respect, I think that's why the FFRC is a Met Police-led matter. Again, it's a support by the local authority to support the police in dealing with that, but it's a Met Police-led matter because they have the primary responsibility for giving casualty information, absolutely not the local authority. So by that protocol, I think the question ought to be redirected to the Met Police as to why they didn't open one at that point.
Well, that's a slightly different answer to a slightly different question. My question is directed at you, the council, and the question is, how come people in those positions were left with not only no information about their loved ones, but no information about the system for getting it, or the place to go? They're wandering around in the streets, which were chaotic, with no means of obtaining any information. And the impression that they got, and you've heard their evidence, is that the system that was supposed to be there to protect them and to inform them had simply disappeared. Are you able to account for that?
No, I think the best I can say is with the sheer scale of what we were dealing with at that point, there wasn't the nice, neat, do this, do that, do the other. I'm afraid we were grasping at that. I accept that the authority at large did not provide some of the facilities as early as it would have been good to. And on behalf of the authority, I again extend an apology for that.
But that leads on to another question, which is, and whether this is Rbkc or whether this is London-wide or whether this is national, it sounds from what you're saying that the scale of Grenfell was too large and too multifaceted to be catered for by the existing contingency arrangements.
Yes, I think that's a fair statement. I think this was beyond a single borough set of arrangements to deal with. And I think I made reference earlier, you were kind enough to give me some space to say that, you know, this is something that I hope the inquiry will look at about scale and about how the capital city makes a response, not just a 1/33rd sliver.
But that gives rise to another question, forgive me, which is how come the contingency arrangements in London weren't equipped for an incident of this scale?
I don't think an incident of this scale was in the risk register. I think over the years, the development of London's local authority and other emergency arrangements were all based on evidence, on the experience year by year of incidents as they came through. And I believe that we all thought at that time that the arrangements that we were continually across the agencies enhancing via way of experience and through exercises had the structures in place for that. I think this Grenfell Tower incident has exposed an area of weakness there, and London needs to address that.
Going back to the Andrew Meek advice, was that not a missed opportunity to use his experience and put those recommendations immediately into effect?
Oh, absolutely, which is why I was advising that the authority seek mutual aid and why I named the individuals that I named. I knew these were people who would have good advice.
And can you account for why it was the case that the HALO and indeed the first HASG, the Humanitarian Assistance Support Group meeting, did not take place until the following day, the 15th of June?
I can't, because I wasn't involved in those commands decision-making or the practical decision-making of that. I would simply, not as an excuse or anything, but simply say that certainly the planning assumptions within those documents and plans were always referred to an a humanitarian assistance centre being established about 48 hours after the incident. So within that, this was certainly within the timescale of the existing planning assumptions for that facility.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, it is. Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Kerry, it's time we all had a break to get some lunch, so we'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. And as before, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone while you're out of the room.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. 2 o'clock, then, please.